Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. We completed most of the Great War, World War One. They used to call it the war to end all wars because of how vicious, violent it was, how many casualties there were. Um, but now we're going to see, of course, later on there will be a World War Two. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it World War One. And we'll finish off World War One today. So we'll finish off the Great War or World War One. Getting a little bit more involved with the United States. Again, we're not going to talk a whole lot about military activity of the United States. Kind of gave a little bit of an overview of how it all worked out. The kind of the key points. You have the trench warfare, machine guns, gases dropped to kill people, the advent of airplanes and the significance thereof during World War One. Right, these are all innovative. We had mortars blowing away people, huge casualty rates during this war. And then we're going to go into this direct American intervention. This will follow the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I don't think the textbook refers to or uses this name, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but there will be, and it maybe they did use that name. I can't remember. That there's of course a couple of different treaties that are signed between Germany and Russia or the Soviet Union. Another one that we'll talk about later on would be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That'll go into World War II. But right now, let's go back. I'm going to use this other map real quick just to kind of give you a visual. So we're going to go back to probably should have gone the other way. So let's use this map real quick just to kind of show. Remember, this was what Europe looked like at the outbreak of the war. Germany is going to be fighting on both sides, right? They're going to be fighting France and England basically to the left, to the west, rather. I didn't mention this other one. I mentioned that secret alliance that Russia and France had that basically, makes this a world war since France is going to jump in when Russia and Austria start fighting each other. The reason France was interested in this is because they wanted protection against Germany. France and Germany had a history of fighting each other. When it was Prussia, before it was Germany, they fought seemingly every few years or few decades at least. There was a Franco-Prussian War in the 1867 timeframe. They fought in the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. They had the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, rather, in the 1750s and 60s. So there's a long history of Germany and France fighting against one another, which is part of the reason why they signed that secret alliance with Russia in case they fought against Germany. But I'll mention Italy real quick since we have this on here. Understand that both Italy and Japan were on the Allied side. Italy and Japan are going to help out in the war effort against, make sure my voice is being recorded. I don't think it is. Okay, so make sure you understand that both Italy and Japan joined the war effort on the Allied side. So Japan is contributing to the war effort, mainly fighting against German forces in like Southeast Asia. Germany has a few territories out there, so Japan's going to help fight in Southeast Asia. Maybe contribute a little bit to the South Pacific. Remember, Germany does have that Samoan island down in the South Pacific as well. So this war isn't just going on in Europe, it's mainly going on in Europe, but Germany does have territories around the world in Africa, South Asia, and the South Pacific. So there is fighting going on out in that area as well, and that's where Japan's kind of pitching in a little bit. Italy, I didn't mention this, but Italy actually had an agreement to join Austria. There was a secret agreement there was an agreement that was known about that Italy had to fight on Austria's side if Austria and France ever went to war. So Italy was actually supposed to be on the Austrian-German side during World War I. But after the war broke out, England invited representatives from Italy to England, to London more specifically, and they signed a secret treaty, right? We talked about that other secret treaty between France and Russia. Now we have a secret treaty in 1915 where Italian representatives go to England, and England says, hey, if you join our side and we win, we're going to make sure that you get some extra land and money as a result of the war. Mainly, they're looking at land around this Balkan coast. So essentially what they're going to wind up doing, what they want to do, is take some land away from Austria-Hungary. Remember, Austria-Hungary was supposed to be their ally before the war, but in 1915, England basically says, if you join their side, you're not going to get anything. You're just going to keep your land and abide by the agreement you signed. It's just a piece of paper. Why don't you join our side instead? And if you join our side, then we'll make sure you get some land and money in return after we win this war. So Italy in 1915 decides not to abide by their agreement with Austria, and instead they join the English side, basically get land and money. Don't worry about the specific land that they're supposed to get. Just know that when they're fighting essentially on the side they weren't supposed to fight on in order to gain material possessions or land at least. So understand that that plays a role too, because Italy and Japan were on the Allied side in this war. Of course, when we get to World War II, those will be two of our main enemies. And the reason why they become two of our main enemies is going to be in part because of what happens after this war. So we'll go back to this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, this was signed in March 3rd of 1918. Remember, Russia was one of the first countries to be involved in this war, right? They declare war on Austria, which then, of course, drives Germany to defend Austria, and then that drives in France. Russia goes through a revolution in February of 1917, and then another revolution starting in October of 1917 that will kind of continue on. So you have this revolution, the October Revolution in 1917, led to the rise of a communist government led by Vladimir Lenin. So Vladimir Lenin is now in charge of Russia, which is about to become the Soviet Union. And of course, under communist ideology, you don't really want to fight for capitalist causes. And when it comes down to it, this war was ordered and led by people who are capitalist and imperialist, and they aren't really supporting the desires of the laborers or working class. So ideologically, this war really isn't in line with what communists, Bolsheviks, when I say Bolsheviks, that's going to be the type of communists that we're talking about. There's also Mensheviks, but we're not going to worry about Mensheviks. See, this Bolshevik communist revolution in October of 1917, and since this war really isn't in line with their ideology, and because they're losing, right? Germany, despite the fact that they're fighting on two fronts, is actually winning in the Russian side for sure, right? Don't worry about this territory yet. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. The reason I'm showing this map right now is because, again, this was pre-World War I Europe. You can see where Germany ends, and you can see that when we get to the end of World War I, that border from Germany, this is where German borders used to go. Germany was able to make their way this far into Russia. This will essentially help create Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and will eventually create a new nation state of Poland again. So Germany did make their way into Russia, gain territory from Russia. So with this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Soviet Union, or Russia, about to be the Soviet Union, says, you know what, you've already taken a bunch of land, we don't know that we're going to be able to beat you, and this war is not really something that we're inclined to support in the first place, so we're going to just call it quits. You keep the land that you've already taken, we'll just stop fighting. So Russia basically concedes the land that Germany had already taken, and they just stop fighting as a result of this. They're going to have an ongoing revolution. They really don't want to be fighting Germany while they're revolting in Russia with this new communist leadership. So now Russia's out of this. Now, this would, in theory at least, make the war a lot easier for Germany to manage, right? At this point, they have a big, strong army, along with Austria's army, but they're fighting on two different fronts. So they have to split their forces in half to fight against Russia on one side and England and France on the other side, which makes it very difficult. But now you get to pull those forces back from the Russian border. You're still going to have to kind of manage Poland, so you're going to have some troops over there. But you get to pull a lot of those forces back over to the west side. And in the west, you're holding your own anyways. In fact, Germany, you could argue, is winning or pretty close to winning the war in early 1918 or 1917 going to 1918. The reason we say that is because this war's been going on for like 3.5 years by this time, and German borders have not been penetrated. I think the fact that they're fighting multiple countries on two different sides, they're surrounded by enemies, they have a British quarantine off the coast, and they're not able to access a lot of their goods from overseas. They're still able to withstand the assaults by Russia, France, England, Italy, and everybody else that's around them. So Germany's actually doing pretty well, despite the fact that they're fighting on two fronts, and the fact that the United States is essentially financing the war for England and France. So England and France aren't really having to pay for a whole lot. They're just getting a lot of loans to pay for the war as we go through this 1917, 1918 time frame. In fact, by the time we get to the end of the war, Allied forces, mainly England and France, are going to build up about $10 billion in debt against the United States. So $10 billion will be owed to the United States, over $10 billion by the time the war is done. So again, that's us financing the war effort. Even when we weren't really involved directly in the war, we're financing the war effort for the most part. So, or a lot of the war effort. So now we're going to start sending troops in. Remember, we declared war in 1917, April of 1917, but we're not going to actually send troops en masse until we get to May of 1918. We were not equipped. Remember, we had a very small army. So when we did war in April of 1917, we didn't really have all the troops, machinery, weapons, tanks. Well, and tanks we'll have some, but they aren't very significant yet. Planes, right? We need to really build up the manufacturing sector. We've already been providing for England and France to a large extent, but we're not really supporting ourselves. So we have a very small army. So when we declare war in April of 1917, we'll send a few troops over there that will basically fight alongside or under command of British and French forces. But we're not going to start sending our own like generals basically with large regiments until we get to May of 1918. So it's basically going to be like 13 months before we really start sending large numbers of troops into Europe. So again, very ill prepared. But keep that in mind, because when we get to World War II, we're going to have a much bigger military force already in place. So we're going to be ready to fight pretty fast when we get to World War II, as opposed to World War I. So we will play a big role in coming to the end of the war, though. Remember, if the United States troops aren't involved and Russia's already withdrawn, there's a pretty decent chance Germany would wind up winning this war if they're only on one front instead of having to fight both east and west. So you could make the argument that without the United States troops being sent into France in 1917, especially in 1918, you can make the argument that Germany would have won, and that's billions of dollars that we may have lost if Germany wins and England and France, who owe us a bunch of money, don't win. So we are going to be very financially invested in this. So keep that in mind. That Woodrow Wilson, all this time, is claiming that he wants to be isolationist. He wants to be neutral. But at the same time, the money is all supporting one side and not so much the other side. And if our one side doesn't win, we're not going to get that money back. So you know that all that money is going into England and France is going to eventually very heavily invest us in this war. Now we'll go on to this Meuse-Argonne offensive. This will lead to the end of the war. So in September of 1918, we have this huge Allied force. We're going to have 1.2 million American troops. Of those American troops, about 200,000 were African American. They would be segregated at the time. You'd still have black units and white units. So we have 1.2 million troops marching in, and we're going to launch this major offensive pushing the German line back in France. Remember, the fighting is mostly being done in France. Now, again, it's not that we have a really superior army. We're getting better, and as we get training, we'll become a very potent force. But we weren't very well trained going into this war. But since we have 1.2 million troops, and the Germans, or the Central Powers anyway, had less than 500,000, we're just going to outnumber them, and we have some fresh bodies and a lot of machinery, a lot of weapons, and we're going to push this line back. So what you're going to see here is you're going to see the maximum advance of the Central Powers. So we're going to see, like, oops, not my YouTube side, I just pushed it forward. So we're going to see. So we're going to see this line, like, right over here. So this dotted line, that's how far the German forces had actually made it before we started sending large troops en masse. And then we're going to start pushing the line back. Eventually, by the time we get to November 1918, we're going to come across this armistice line, which is right over here. You see this kind of brownish or copper-colored line, whatever this is. So take it all the way back there. That's where we're going to essentially end the war. The German Kaiser, you know, their main leader, steps down. A new government is established, and that new government wants to end the war, basically because they've already lost 2 million lives, and they believe that if the war continued to go on with American forces now involved and American money heavily involved, that eventually they were going to lose anyways. But one sticking point is going to be this. How far into Germany did Allied troops advance? We didn't get there at all. We maybe touch Alsace and Lorraine. We're going to talk about Alsace and Lorraine. Here's Alsace over here. And then we have Lorraine over here. This will be kind of a disputed territory that we're going to talk about when we get to Wilson's 14 points. So we make our way into Alsace and Lorraine a little bit, just barely. We really don't get into Germany proper. So if you're a German citizen, you may start to wonder why it is that they give up. Right? As we go in the 1920s and Germany is under a terrible economic situation, and they've conceded this war that we're going to talk about with this terrible treaty that's going to hurt the Germans tremendously, they're going to question why it is they gave up in the first place. After all, they had more troops on the Eastern Front that they could still move over to the Western Front. Right? In theory, they could have pushed back with another offensive to go back, push further back into France without having to worry about Russia, and maybe not so much about those colonial possessions in Africa, Asia, and the South Pacific. So this issue right here, where Allied forces never make it into Germany, is going to wind up playing a big role in what leads up to the rise of Nazi power in the 1920s and 1930s, because they're really going to build upon this idea that the German government just sold them out. Now, our general that led this Meuse-Argonne offensive, basically this last 6 weeks of the war, was General John J. Pershing, and you may remember General John J. Pershing. His name is Blackjack Pershing. John J. Pershing was the same general that wasn't able to capture Pancho Villa in Mexico. But now he's going to lead this, and he's pretty well renowned as being a very effective general leading up to the end of this war. He was also somewhat involved in the Spanish-American War, so he's been around a long time. So General John J. Pershing will lead this Meuse-Argonne offensive. This offensive that we lead is going to lead to Germany giving up with this new government. And leading up to this, we're going to have a Paris Peace Conference in 1919. But before we get to that, make sure you understand Wilson's or familiar with Wilson's 14 points. I can see my bullet points. I don't have 14. I think I have like 9. And they're very brief and summarized. But he gives a speech in 1918, before we get to the end of the war, that said, once the war is over, this is what we should do to make the world a better place to avoid future conflicts. Woodrow Wilson, as I mentioned before, is very opinionated about what should be done diplomatically to address foreign relations matters and create a long-lasting peace. But again, as I mentioned, Woodrow Wilson had very little experience dealing with foreign relations matters before he became president, and maybe his ideas are realistic in some cases. We're going to go through some of these 14 points. Understand that when we get to the exam next week, there's a pretty good chance, and you may even see this on the chapter quiz or one of those quizzes there's a pretty good chance that you'll see a question that says, which of the following was not one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? You know, what are they not really looking at? But you know, he calls for these open covenants of peace. Basically, is that we should not have secret treaties and secret alliances. So that alliance that Russia and France had, that's a big no-no. There's that secret treaty England and Italy had, that's a big no-no. There's some other secret alliances and treaties that were made to coax other nations and individuals to support the war effort. So Woodrow Wilson says, you know, if you don't have these secret treaties or secret alliances, you may not have had a world war in the first place, right? Germany may not have been so willing to attack Russia and support that offensive if they knew that France was going to attack right away too, and that England would jump in also. And Austria thought that it'll support them, but they wound up joining the English side instead, right? So we have this open covenant of peace. We have freedom of navigation seas. We're starting restriction submarine warfare in 1918. And the thing is that basically the States is using or is supporting the war effort from all around the world through the ocean. So we want freedom of navigation upon the seas to end naval conflict, free and equal trade among the nations. Basically, this idea is that if you charge tariffs to some countries and no tariffs to others, then you'd wind up having countries create alliances, and this will lead to conflict through competition. You'd have this reduction of national armaments. We're going to start building on that a little bit in the 1920s with something called the Washington Naval Treaty or Washington Naval Pact. So we're going to talk about that, but basically the argument is if you keep building these huge navies and huge armies, then they're bound to fight, right? You're going to have more confidence that you can get your way through force if you have big militaries. If you don't have a big military, you're not going to say, hey, I'm going to get my way by using the military to push other countries around. So he's going to say that we should have a reduction of national armaments. This will play a role in Germany that we'll talk about also. Colonial interests should be considered. So basically, if we should look at independence of colonies. So after the war is over, if and when we beat Germany or the Ottoman Empire, then we should give their colonies independence or some semblance of independence. That's going to be the idea. Alsace and Lorraine, I just showed that on the map. Woodrow Wilson argued that Alsace and Lorraine, those two territories that I showed you, should be given back to France. Alsace and Lorraine were taken by Germany or Prussia at the time after the Franco-Prussian War in 1867. So about 50 years earlier, Alsace and Lorraine were taken by Germany. When they did that, Germany starts passing laws in Alsace and Lorraine restricting the utilization of the French language in schools. They start teaching German culture. So basically, they're turning the people in Alsace and Lorraine into Germans. But Woodrow Wilson is saying that despite the fact that it's been 50 years and that Germany, the German language and German culture has been pushed into Alsace and Lorraine should be returned back to France because France was upset about it being taken 50 years earlier. Woodrow Wilson also believed that countries should be separated by ethnicity. I mentioned eugenicism, right? Eugenics, where you have this kind of ranking of the races. Woodrow Wilson is not a eugenicist, but as we get into the 19 teens and 1920s, going into the 1930s, sociologists would make these arguments that the reason we have spikes in crime isn't necessarily because of the superiority or inferiority of certain races that come into conflict with one another. They would make the argument, though, that you have more peace when you have segregated communities. So if you're making the argument that Irish and English and Italians and Poles or Germans are all fighting one another, the way you resolve that is keep them all separate. Keep the Irish in one community, the Italians in another community, the Germans in another community, right? African Americans in another community. So if you can kind of keep them all segregated, then you'll have minimal interaction amongst the groups, and with the minimal interaction, then you're going to have less violence. That's the argument that Woodrow Wilson and a lot of sociologists were making in the 19-teens, 20s, and early 30s. I remember reading a thesis that was written at Texas Christian University in the late 1920s, and actually another one that I read that was written, I think, in the late 30s or early 40s, that discussed the city of Fort Worth and argued that the reason you didn't have as much crime in Fort Worth or violent crime in Fort Worth was because you didn't have as many people of different races. They compared Fort Worth to like New York City, where New York City has like this huge number of multiple ethnicities and races all kind of jumbled together, and Fort Worth really didn't have that so much. So when they're breaking down why crime wasn't so bad in Fort Worth, they said in this thesis from TCU that the reason we don't have as much crime is because we don't have so many different immigrant communities in Fort Worth. That was their argument. But that's in line with what Wilson is saying. Countries should be separated by ethnicity. If you basically create countries based upon race or ethnicity, then you're less likely to have conflict within those countries. They'll be just happy as they are. And then we have this independent Polish state. There was a Poland that existed in this up until the 1790s. In the 1790s, it was either 1790 or 95, I can't remember which year, but around 1790 or 95, Poland was invaded from the east by Russia and from the west by Germany. So about for the past 120, 125 years like that, Poland had been wiped off the map, and there was like a Polish states basically that were part of Russia and Germany. So Woodrow Wilson is saying that we should recreate a Poland. That's, even though it was taken off the map 120 years ago, we should recreate this Poland. And we have this League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson proposed this League of Nations, basically saying that in order to avoid future conflict, what we should have is like a group of countries that can mediate issues between or among other countries, and by having this League of Nations, you can avoid future wars. So these are all part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Again, you want to be familiar with them to the point where you can identify what is not part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So it's not like you have to write these down, but you will want to be able to recognize which one would not be part of the 14 points. Now, we're going to see what winds up happening from these 14 points, because we get to the Paris Peace Conference in June of 1919, Woodrow Wilson will participate. He will travel to Paris, France. The people of Paris, France loved Woodrow Wilson because he's kind of seen as this enlightened leader, right? He has these, in their minds, he has these great ideas on what we can do to avoid future wars and create a long-lasting peace in the world. Now, clearly, that's not going to wind up happening, right? 20 years later, we're going to have World War II. But that's what these people of Paris are thinking. They're thinking that Woodrow Wilson is this enlightened leader that's going to keep us from having a future conflict like what we just had. So we're going to see, essentially, England and France take over this conference. England is led by a guy named Lloyd George. France was led by a guy named Clemenceau. Don't worry about their names. Their names will not come up. But I just want to make sure that if I say Clemenceau or Lord George, you know that I'm talking about the French leader or the English leader. So Lloyd George and Clemenceau lead the Paris Peace Conference. Japan, Italy, United States, all these other countries are part of the conference, but really England and France are going to dominate it. Woodrow Wilson's not real healthy, and he's going to die shortly after his term in office anyways. Within just a year or two after leaving office, he'll die. So he's going to be kind of weakened and not really take a strong position when he's there. But when they draft up this Treaty of Versailles to officially end the war in June of 1919, they're going to use Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to kind of draft the Treaty of Versailles, at least to the extent that it helps England and France and hurts Germany. So what we're going to do is we're going to refashion Germany's borders, right? This is Germany before the war. Sorry, trying to get my mouse to show up in my YouTube. There we go. This is Germany before the war. See how far it is east to west. And this is Germany after the war. So basically you have all of this land right over here taken away from Germany. This, basically like half Poland was taken away from Germany. You see this little part down here. Czechoslovakia was also created. That's a brand new country. It's meant for the Slovakians, the Slavic people who live in the area. Austria-Hungary, I think I mentioned yesterday that Austria-Hungary had a bunch of different races, mainly Germans and Magyars, but you also had this other group of Slavs amongst Jews and people of Islamic faith as well would also be there. So we're going to really shrink Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary is much, much smaller. They're separated into two different countries. We're going to create new nations of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania as a result of this war. So we create all these new countries, and of course that land was taken by Germany as part of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So all of this land over here that's green was under German control for at least the last year or two before the war was over. So they're taking all that land away that they gained, and then they're also breaking up what used to be Germany. Of course, you can see also this little territory down here. That's your Alsace and Lorraine territory. We're going to create this German Rhineland. This will be taken away from German control. Germany is not allowed to send their military over. The Saar Valley as well. So we're going to see Germany really shrunk, and they're going to take away all the colonial possessions. So everything that Germany had in Asia, Africa, and the South Pacific, all of that will be taken away from Germany as well. In addition to that, Germany will have a smaller army. We're going to cap their army at like 100,000 people. Now remember, before the war, Germany had an army of like 4 million, over 4 million. Now, two of the big keys to the German economy historically were iron and steel and the military. Those are two of the big keys to the economy. So when you greatly shrink the army and you take away a lot of land where the iron ore was mined to produce for their steel factories, then you're really going to cripple their economy. So we're going to cripple their economy, and you're going to make Germany responsible for the war. We mentioned that yesterday. There is a war guilt clause that's part of this Treaty of Versailles. That war guilt clause said that Germany had to pay the Allied nations, mainly England and France, $33 billion. $33 billion. Now, England and France want that money in large parts to make up for their own debt that they built up in the United States and to pay for their own war effort that they lost out of their own treasury. So Germany is made fully responsible for the war. Is the war all Germany's fault? I had that poll yesterday, and I think 3 out of like 11 students said that it was Germany's fault. You can make the argument, certainly. And Germany, through the late 19th and early 20th century, was a very militaristic, very aggressive country. They were expanding around the world. There was tension between Germany and England and at times the United States. So you could make the argument that Germany in some way was responsible for the war because of that expansion. Maybe Austria doesn't act so aggressively against the Soviet Union without Germany's support. But at the same time, you could say, well, Russia shouldn't have attacked Austria when Austria tried to clamp down on this situation after the Archduke was assassinated. Or you could say, well, had France not joined in with this secret treaty, it would have just been a war between Russia and Austria with the known alliance of Germany helping out. And you can also say that the reason the war lasted as long as it did was because the United States was really financing the war from overseas, which helped England and France continue the war, despite the fact that Germany was pushing westward and kind of winning the war for a lot of that time. So there's other countries that could be responsible, whether it be for the outbreak of the war or for the length and long-term damage of the war. But let's go back here. So Germany would be held responsible for the reparations. Now, I'll mention these colonies and these Austria-Hungarian territories that were taken away. Remember, the main reason that Italy joined the war was to gain more land. What they wanted was to take territories away from this Austria-Hungary territory. But instead of doing that, we're going to create a whole new nation-state of Yugoslavia. So basically, England and France at the conference are going to tell Italy, we understand that you joined the war through this Treaty of London in 1915, and the purpose of you going to the war on our side was so you could get land and money, but you're not going to get it because it was a secret treaty, and Woodrow Wilson said we shouldn't have secret treaties. So we're going to do what Woodrow Wilson said. You can't necessarily blame Woodrow Wilson for Italy not getting the land, but England and France are going to capitalize on the 14 points and say that we shouldn't give Italy land and let them profit off the war. We should just kind of end it and just punish the countries that were involved or responsible in the first place. So Italy basically joins this war to get money and land, and they wind up losing lives, military deaths, 651,000. If you count civilian deaths, 1.2 million. So over 1.2 million Italians died in this war. For what reason? For no reason, right? And their economy is in a shambles coming out of this war. So Italy is in a terrible position. Their leader was a guy named Bo Orlando. So Orlando comes back to Italy after the Paris Peace Conference, and he tells his people, we just lost 1.2 million people, citizens. We lost all these civilians as a result of the war. And what do we get out of it? Nothing, except for a bad economy. So what's going to wind up happening in the early 1920s, right after this, is Orlando is going to be removed from power, and you're going to see this coup d'etat, this basically rise of what they call the Black Shirt movement. And the leader of this movement is a guy named Benito Mussolini. So Mussolini is going to come into power in the early 1920s, mainly because people are not happy with their Italian leadership following World War I, and we're wondering why the heck were we involved in this war in the first place. So this will have a direct relationship with the rise of this fascist leadership led by Benito Mussolini, who of course is going to be one of our main enemies going into World War II. This whole German thing, I've already mentioned that. The Nazi Party is going to capitalize off of these reparations, getting this war guilt clause, and also say we shouldn't have ended fighting anyways because they never even made it into Germany, right? Now, Japan sends their own representatives to the conference too. Japan wanted this Treaty of Versailles to include this statement saying that all races should be looked at equally because the Asian people tended to be looked down upon by Europeans, just like the United States, right? The United States had already passed this legislation that had banned Chinese immigration. They'd already had that gentleman's agreement. We didn't want the Japanese people over here after 1907 because of that yellow peril. And these European countries kind of viewed Japan the same way. They viewed them as inferior people, right? And this does play a little bit to these social Darwinist and eugenics ideas of superior races and inferior races. In the Japanese, similarly or equally as European people, And the European people, mainly England and France, said, no, we're not going to include that clause. So the Japanese diplomats who attend this conference go back to Japan and say they treated us like crud. We went over there, we helped out with the war effort, we helped defeat the Germans in Asia and elsewhere, and then we go to the conference and they treat us like they don't need us and they don't care about us and that we're inferior. So that's going to lead to a rise of anti-European sentiment in Japan. And of course, Japan, when we get to the 1930s, is going to become very aggressive, and they're not going to really care about European countries. In fact, they're going to start taking away land from European countries as we get into the 1930s and early 1940s. So there is a direct relationship with Italy, of course, Germany, and Japan leading into this. When we get to World War II, it really has those roots in World War I. I'm going to mention something else about this idea from the Wilson's 14 points. Remember, he said that countries should be separated by ethnicity. Now, again, the reason for this is because it was thought by many, not just Wilson, but by other sociologists and maybe anthropologists to an extent, that if you have people who are all the same race in one area, you'll be less prone to have violence because you remove that idea of racial or ethnic violence, right? Now, what that also does, or the to ask is, are there any countries in the entire world that are all one ethnicity? No, absolutely not. There are no countries that are all one ethnicity. There's multi-ethnic groups, multiple ethnic groups in everywhere you go. It may be a limited number in some places, but there's always going to be some other, right? What they call a significant other in any country that you go to. So when you're saying we should create a country for Poles, or we should create a country for Slavs, or we should create a country for Saxons or Aryans, then what you're basically saying is that that country should be catered towards those races. And what winds up happening if you create countries based upon race or ethnicity is the people who are not that race or ethnicity are going to wind up being subjugated people, second-class citizens with fewer, if any, civil rights. So when he's saying separate countries by ethnicity, you're basically saying the countries that are built upon ethnicities are going to have people who are not that ethnicity that aren't going to have the rights as the preferred favorite group of that country that represent that country. So there are some serious flaws with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points that are going to come to light as we go forward. And again, a lot of what winds up happening at the Treaty of at this Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles is going to be crafted by Woodrow Wilson's 14 point. We are going to mention something else that was just in my mind. I'll think of it again in just a moment. League of Nations. We will create this League of Nations. So there will be a League of Nations. Now, the way it was drafted, the way it's supposed to be, is that the 5 main countries that were involved in defeating the Germans would be the leading nations in the League of Nations. You have like 5 permanent members: England, France, United States, Japan, and Italy. Notice I have United States, England, France, Japan, and Italy. Of course, Japan and Italy are going to wind up being our enemies as we go in the 1930s and 40s. So if you have 2 of the member countries antagonizing the other 3, that's going to create problems. Another big issue is the United States doesn't join the League of Nations. That Treaty of Versailles included creating the League of Nations. So remember, a president or his cabinet cannot ratify a treaty. You know, they negotiate the treaty, and then the treaty then comes back to the United States Senate, and the United States Senate then has to ratify the treaty. Right? We don't have a president that is an authoritarian dictator. A president can't just issue laws and decrees. What the president has to do is create or negotiate the treaty. The treaty then comes back to the United States Senate. The United States Senate, in theory, represents the people, and then the people, Senate, will then decide whether or not what the treaty negotiated is legitimate and good for the country. And the Senate rejects the treaty. So the Treaty of Versailles is not our treaty. We wound up signing a separate treaty later on, but we will not join the League of Nations. And that's a big part, right? We are one of the most significant countries in ending this war. The Treaty of Versailles, a lot of it's crafted on these ideas espoused by Americans, but we don't even wind up ratifying it. If you recall, the Senate Majority Leader and one of the most significant senators going before 1920 was Henry Cabot Lodge. So Henry Cabot Lodge was very much against this Treaty of Versailles. So he leads this fight against ratification, and we don't join the League of Nations because of that. So make sure you know that we were not part of the League of Nations, and we did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. It is ratified by those other countries, and Germany did accept that war guilt clause, but that was very problematic for the German people. We'll go to the first Red Scare. We'll mention this again when we get to the Roaring 20s, because this will kind of play a role going into the 20s as well. But understand that when we get to the 1919 time frame, there will be a lot of concerns about Bolshevism, communism, basically infiltrating the United States government. Remember, Russia had a government overthrown with a communist regime in October of 1917. So there are fears that socialist communism is going to spread to the United States and that our government will also be overthrown. I'm going to describe the differences between democracy and communism in a little more detail when we get to the Cold War. Communists believe that they were democratic. They believe that the United States was not democratic because of capitalism. Basically, they would argue that as long as you have a capitalist country, you can't have a democracy because money plays too much of a role in who actually has power. That's going to be the argument that communists will make in a nutshell. So they believe that they were a democracy, or they would argue that anyways, and that we were not. So we have these fears of Bolshevism and these fears of anarchism. There were plots to assassinate the president. In fact, in April of 1919, the Secret Service learned of a plot to assassinate the President Wilson. And in 1919, postal workers intercepted 40 homemade bombs that were addressed to Woodrow Wilson. Now, keep in mind that this was after the Sedition and Espionage Acts had passed. There are limitations on freedom of speech, so there are a lot of people who are not happy with it at this point. And also keep in mind that there are a lot of people that were against the war effort altogether because we had all these German and Irish immigrants who really didn't like England that much or sided with the German country. I will mention, I think, one other issue. Now, we'll go ahead and end there, I think, for that part. We'll mention this guy. I think this guy could possibly come up. In June of 1919, there was an Italian anarchist, so the guy from Italy, named Carlo Valdinocci. Valdinocci is spelled V as in Victor, Aldinoci, Valdinocci. Carlo Valdinocci wanted to assassinate the United States Attorney General's home. The Attorney General is going to be responsible for upholding U.S. federal laws. And he went to the Attorney General's house. He had a suitcase with dynamite in it. And as he was making his way up the staircase, he tripped and fell and blew himself up. So he didn't kill the Attorney General. He wound up killing himself instead while badly damaging the house, of course, too. So Carlo Valdinocci, this Italian anarchist, is then considered the first suicide bomber in U.S. history. So we did that rise up in 1919. We're going to talk more about that first Red Scare as we go into the 1919 summer. We'll just finish off by showing these numbers. So again, these are the number of people killed and wounded in World War I. United States loses, 116,000, 117,000 people altogether during World War I. Definitely a significant number, 117,000, but not nearly what these other countries lost. Russia, altogether over 3 million people. France, 1.7 million. Italy, again, to 1.2 million. England, or United Kingdom anyways, about 1 million people. And then if we go to the other side, we can see that Germany lost, 2.5 million people. Ottoman Empire, about 3 million. I'll mention something real quick about the Ottoman Empire. Keep in mind the Ottoman Empire controlled the Middle East. So once the war is over, of course, we're going to take away those colonial possessions of the Ottoman Empire. You'll have just basically a nation state of Turkey created going into the 1920s. And those Middle East territories are going to be kind of managed or maybe protected, you might say, by European countries, mainly England and France. So it's going to be at this time that you're going to start seeing kind of a push to create a Jewish nation state. So we're going to see that start right around this point. We're going to come back to that when we get to the Cold War, because we're going to create the nation state of Israel in 1948. But we're really going to start pushing towards that right around this 1918, 1919 time frame. I think we'll go ahead and take our first break right now before we go into the 1920s. So I'll give you guys about 12 minutes. We'll say 9:35. We'll pick back up, and then we'll start into the 1920s time frame. We may get to the Great Depression today, but if not, it's not a big deal. We have tomorrow dedicated to that as well. So again, 9:35 we'll reconvene, and I'll give you guys a little break to stretch your legs, grab a snack, do whatever you need to do. All right.
was gone and the memory fade, and the crowds don't remember me. When my hands don't fade, strange the same way. I know you will still love me the same. 'Cause honey, your soul could never grow old, it's evergreen.
Okay, we are back. 9:35. I'll go ahead and get it started back up. Let's see if there's anything I wanted to say before I get started. I do want to make sure everybody does know that the exams have all been graded. Everybody did take the exam in the 24-hour window. I think somebody took it at, I think, at 5:59 this morning. I normally get up. Right now, I'm getting up around 5 or 5:30 in the morning. When I teach on campus, I usually get up around 4:10, 4:15, something like that. But I'm sleeping in a little bit right now since I don't have to make that commute. But I did notice that somebody took it early this morning, but made it well within the 24-hour window. So good job, everybody doing that promptly. The median grade, which is more accurate than the average grade, averages can be skewed by high or low numbers. The median grade was like 83%, which is pretty good. And I mentioned yesterday that normally for a 16-week semester, it's going to be around 76%, something like that. And that 83% is about what I was looking for a Maymester class, since mini mesters tend to be stronger on average than a long semester. So good job. There were a few grades that were a little bit lower, but that's the first exam. You'll know, what to do, I think, a little bit better in preparation for the next exam. Again, that study guide is on Blackboard. I posted that yesterday. So it'd be a good idea to kind of use that even for taking notes now if you wanted to. Just print that up in a lot of space and then kind of write notes using that as we go along in preparation for the next exam. But good job overall. Overall, the grades in the class have been pretty strong, and you guys, for the most part, have done pretty well at completing the chapter quizzes. I think almost everybody. I've got it up here. I don't want to pull up all that information. It's too detailed on my YouTube side. But I think most people have done 2, if not 3, of the chapter quizzes. I believe we're supposed to go through the first 3. You may have touched on the 4th one for the exam. So just keep going. You guys are doing pretty well. Let's go ahead and start with the 1920s. We'll talk about women first. Now, when we get to the final exam, one of the questions I will often ask on a final exam will have to do with the progression of women's rights as you kind of go through the 20th century. So you kind of keep track of this. Remember, we already talked about women's suffrage kind of pushing up through the early 1900s. They also played a big role in, to some extent, in prohibition. Remember that Prohibition Amendment, that 18th Amendment, which will outlaw or ban, sale, manufacturing, consumption of alcohol beginning in 1920. We just, I guess, we just passed the 100-year anniversary of ratification of that amendment, but I believe it was in effect like in November of 1920, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was November or December. But anyways, women did play a big role in that. Of course, that does get ratified thanks in large part to the fact that a lot of the brewers, a lot of people that manufactured the alcohol in the United States were German. So we're going to capitalize off of that anti-German sentiment in order to pass prohibition, because a lot of the people who were making beer were people of German descent. So we're going to kind of punish them and say, well, Germany's bringing us this beer and it's ruining society, right? So we get to 1920, and we're going to see a rise of women in the workforce. Women would have these what we call pink-collar jobs. These would be jobs like secretaries, sales clerks, telephone operators. So not necessarily like the sweatshop jobs, right? There were a lot of women already working like in textiles. That they'd be typists. They'd work on sewing machines, sewing machine operators. A lot of those jobs you'd be in like cramped, congested conditions with little ventilation. It'd be hot in the summer. There's stories of like buildings burning down and everybody working inside dying. Right now, that's the kind of positions that they had already had in the early 20th century that progressives were trying to address. Now we're going to see them kind of move out. Some of them move out of that atmosphere. And you'll start seeing them work in a little more comfortable environments. It's still not going to be great wages, but it'll be better than some of those sweatshop type jobs might have been. And it'd probably be a little more fun, right? You'd rather be a sales clerk than work in a 100-degree room operating a sewing machine for 10 or 11 hours a day, right? So you see these blue-collar jobs. Most of them will be taken by young ladies, late teens into the 20s, possibly early 30s. Again, a lot of times married women would not be expected to have jobs like this unless you really needed to make ends meet as a poverty-struck family. But with this money, you'll see a lot of these young ladies express freedom. You'll have jobs and money that you didn't have before, and you're going to have this newfound freedom. You're going to challenge some of the social norms and start wearing these new fashions, dancing to this rising jazz music. When we get to the 1920s, jazz music plays a big role in culture and in entertainment. They would smoke and drink. By the 1920s, you had the diaphragm invented, so they will be practicing some method of birth control as well. And then we'll talk a little bit more about birth control in just a minute. So they're really kind of challenging a lot of the social norms that women had been accountable for before, respected to account for anyways. So in some minds, this is going to be a great thing. You'll also see the rise of petting parties in the 1920s. The petting parties is going to be a time when young men and women, for the most part, would experiment sexually. And that's very controversial in the 1920s at that time in that atmosphere. So, of course, some young women will play a role in that as well. But again, they're exercising these new freedoms and liberties that were going to be criticized roundly by conservative moralists, right? To a lot of these young women and to a lot of women who were pushing for more liberties and economic freedom for women, this is all good stuff. But to some of the more old-fashioned conservative moralists, this is just a sign of a degenerating society. It's kind of building on World War I, right? World War I is just a nightmarish time where millions of people wind up dying and Europe is just destroyed. Industries are hurt, farms are gone, and basically in their point of view, these women who are now out drinking, smoking, and having sex with partners that they're not married to is just a sign that the whole world is just falling apart. That's how a conservative moralist would have seen this in the 1920s. One woman who is significant in this time frame is a woman named Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a nurse and midwife in Manhattan. So she's in New York City, so she's in Manhattan. You will want to know the name Margaret Sanger. Remember, the next exam will have a matching segment as well, and some of the multiple choice questions may ask about this stuff too. But Margaret Sanger was a nurse and midwife, so she delivered babies and took care of expectant mothers. And she tended to work a lot in tenements in New York City. And we've discussed those tenements, those filthy, crowded, congested, poorly ventilated places that bred disease. She worked in those tenements quite often, and she noticed that when she goes into a lot of these homes or tenements, a lot of these tenement homes, again, is very, very poor people. But she also noticed that these people who made very little money had very big families, right? They had 8, 10, 12 kids. I'll tell you that my grandmother was born to a poverty-struck family. This is my dad's mother. She was born in 1917. She was the oldest of 12 siblings herself, at least 12 that survived. I think there were 2 or 3 that actually died in childbirth. But she was the oldest of 12 children, And this is a family that, the entire family lived in like a probably 1,200 square foot home with one little bathroom. So it's so this is in line with what was going on in the 1920s. You had these very poor families, very poor families, a bunch of kids. Margaret Sanger herself was one of 11 kids, so she knew that herself. And she basically made the argument that we need to allow families and women in particular to practice birth control, because without birth control, these poverty-struck families are just going to have it worse and worse and worse, because it's hard enough to feed a family with a small income of just one or two kids, let alone having 10 kids in your household. So she created the American Birth Control League. Now, bear in mind that a lot of what she's doing in the 19 teens and 1920s would be considered vulgar and oftentimes illegal. Distributing pamphlets or other literature that is encouraging people to have sex without the expectation, or trying not to have children, was oftentimes seen as obscene. So she was arrested at times because of some of the literature that she was circulating in the 19-teens. But by 1921, she created the American Birth Control League. So that's created in 1921, and they will focus on educating women on the methods of birth control. And of course, they're going to start distributing diaphragms. And by the time we get to the 1940s, the American Birth Control League will change its name to Planned Parenthood. So Planned Parenthood is essentially established by Margaret Sanger as the American Birth Control League in 1921. Planned Parenthood, of course, is still around today. They educate and manage birth control options, and they are controversial in today's world too. So you'll oftentimes see Planned Parenthood as a controversial subject for pro-lifers in particular. But this will all start in 1921 with Margaret Sanger. Then we'll get to the Great Migration in 1916 to 1970. The Great Migration will be the migration of African Americans to cities in the North. Remember, we talked a little bit about some African Americans going to cities, and most of the big cities were in the North during the late 19th century, but it wasn't a huge number because an African American man wouldn't get a job that's any better than they had in the South, and you'd be leaving home, leaving your community and your family. But now, as we get into the World War I era, these factories are going to be expanding greatly. They're going to be mass producing large numbers of goods, and they're going to need more laborers, because a lot of the laborers that were working at these factories are now going off to war in Europe. They're being recruited by or conscripted by the United States Armed Forces. So there's a big push to increase labor at these big factories across North. Cities like New York City, Detroit, New York City, New York, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio, right? These big cities in the North that had large industrial complexes are now actively recruiting African Americans to work in their factories, and these would be better paying jobs than what they had in the South or what they could have had in the North before. So we're going to see huge numbers of African Americans moving to the North between 1916 and 1919 at first. So about 1 million people just in that first 3 years, between 1916 and 1919. By the time we push this out to 1970, that number is going to grow to about 6 million. So we have at least 1 million to start, and then 6 million long-term as part of this great migration, with African Americans moving to cities to take better paying jobs and hopefully live in safer neighborhoods, although that's not always going to be the case. Now, this will lead to what we call Red Summer. This is part of that Red Scare. I talked about that first Red Scare in 1919, where people are concerned that communists and anarchists are going to try to overthrow the government. Well, in combination with that, we're going to have this movement of African Americans vying for economic and political power in these northern cities where they didn't have quite that African American population before. And since they're challenging for power, they are a threat to the existing power structure. Not only that, but they're taking jobs that were held by white people historically, And sometimes white soldiers would come back from Europe after serving in time of war, move back to like Chicago or New York, and they try to get their job back, but their job is being held by African Americans. And that's going to raise racial violence and problems in northern cities. Some issues in the South as well, but North for sure. You know, during the summer, during 1919, we call this Red Summer, but Red Summer really goes from like April to like November of 1919. So from this spring to early fall time frame, this long summer you might call it, there were at least 26 race riots across the country, including 97 recorded lynchings, and and out of those 97 lynchings, 13 of them were against African American World War I veterans. So we see this massive rise of violence against African Americans in 1919. Some very large race riots. One of the biggest, rather, is the Chicago race riot. Again, this is just one of 26. This isn't the only one. In Chicago, Illinois, in 1919, there was an African American teenage boy named Eugene Williams. Eugene Williams was on Lake Michigan. Now, if you've been to Lake Michigan in Chicago and you look across the lake, it looks like an ocean, right? It's a massive lake. So you'd have these big beaches, and Eugene Williams gets like on a raft on Lake Michigan, and his raft floats over to the white part of the beach. Now, in the North, you did have segregation. Now, it's not de jure, it's de facto. De jure basically means it's legislation. I'm sorry, it's segregation that is legislated. So, like in the South, you tended to have de jure segregation, meaning that there's states and city laws that are put in place that legally segregate, white and black races, for example. De facto means that basically you're going to see the creation of segregated territories because of conditions within the cities and states that aren't necessarily legalized or legislated. So you're going to see segregated areas in the North as well. Some of this will involve like restrictive housing covenants when we talk about neighborhoods. The Eugene Williams raft floats over to like the white part of the beach, and people get mad. These white people start getting mad. They start throwing rocks at Eugene Williams. A violent confrontation ensues, and basically what winds up happening is Eugene Williams is, I believe, knocked unconscious, falls into Lake Michigan, and drowns. So he's now been murdered, right? He's been killed by these white people on the beach in Michigan that were upset that he crossed the boundaries into the white part of the segregated beach. So he's now been killed. The police come to try to resolve this chaos that ensues after this. And when they break up this event or address this event, nobody's arrested, right? African Americans and others will point out the people responsible for killing Eugene Williams, but the police refuse to arrest anybody. So when they refuse to arrest anybody, you see large-scale rioting in Chicago for a week. This will go from July 27th of 1919 to August 3rd of 1919. So for a full week, you have rioting across Chicago. Chicago had a 3,500-man police force, and they were not able to control the rioting. In fact, in a lot of cases, they didn't really care as long as they're not affecting the white parts of town. So a lot of the black part of town in Chicago and South Chicago was destroyed. Altogether, around 1,000 black families lost their homes, burned down by rioters. Altogether, 38 people were killed over the course of a week, with another 500 people injured because of the Chicago race riot of 1919. Again, this is just part of this red summer, and this where we have these concerns about African Americans moving into white communities and taking traditional white jobs, while at the same time facing these fears of anarchism and communism. Keep in mind that a lot of times civil rights activists from this point through the 1950s and maybe 1960s to extent, a lot of those civil rights activists will be accused of being communist because they're looking for the equality of all people. And communism in and of itself seeks to make all workers, all laborers, equal regardless of race or ethnicity. So there are connections between communism and civil rights struggles. So even if you're not a communist, a lot of times civil rights activists will be considered or accused of being communist. So now we'll go on to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So as we go through this Great Migration, you will see this rising class of African American intellectual elites, business elites, labor leaders. And when you talk about labor leaders for African Americans in the 20th century, the main person you'd want to know is this guy, A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was originally from the South. He moved up to New York in the 19 teens. And when he moved up to New York, he became a labor leader. He started leading various labor rights struggles in the late 19 teens, and finally he was endorsed to be the leader of this brand new labor organization called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was mainly a union that represented African Americans who worked on trains. So remember, trains are going to be the main way you go across the country. We will see the rise of commercial airlines in the 1920s. Very few people traveled on those airlines. The vast majority are going to be taking trains. Every now and then buses, but mainly trains. So A. Philip Randolph represented these African American laborers because when you traveled across the country, you're going to sleep in sleeping cars. And if you're in a sleeping car, you're going to have people who are going to bring things to you that you will order. They'll carry your luggage. They'll answer questions, find accommodations for you, whatever. So kind of like a flight attendant in today's world, but you're taking these trips for days on end, not just a few hours. And you're also, I guess, serving them. So it's kind of a combination between like a waiter and a flight attendant in today's world. So you have these Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that rises up. Again, most of the sleeping car porters are African American, and it's not a terrible job, right? If your option is working in a low-wage job for long hours and dangerous conditions, or getting on a train and traveling across the country and just carrying luggage and food every now and then, you may want to take that job. So it's a job that's sought after. Plus, you get to travel all over the country. You're not confined to one location. It can be fairly interesting also. So a lot of African Americans wanted this, but since a lot of African Americans wanted this job, that also gave management the ability to say, well, we're not going to pay you that much because it'd be easy to replace you. So in 1925, these sleeping car porters are going to be pushing for shorter hours and better pay, basically. A. Philip Randolph is going to lead that charge. The main company that we're looking at is the Pullman Palace Car Company that we talked about in the 1890s. The Pullman Palace Car Company is still your biggest car company when it comes to sleeping cars. So A. Philip Randolph will lead this organization, and he'll push and push and push until 1937. In 1937, this Pullman Palace Car Company finally agreed to negotiate a contract to improve pay, benefits, and hours for African American workers in 1937. So it's going to take a long time for this to work out, but A. Philip Randolph refuses to give up. Now, A. Philip Randolph will be very significant going forward as well. We're going to bring him back up when we get to World War II in a few days, and we're going to bring him back up when we get to the Civil Rights Movement. That one of the most famous speeches in American history is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, that "I Have a Dream" speech was delivered at the Great March on Washington for Jobs in 1963, and that Great March on Washington was organized by A. Philip Randolph. So he's going to be significant from the 1920s, if not earlier, all the way into the 1960s. So again, when we're talking about labor leaders, African American labor leaders, then we are looking at A. Philip Randolph. He is the #1 guy in the 20th century pushing for African American labor rights. Now, we'll move to other minority communities. We'll discuss the Japanese people and how they are faring too. Now, I'm going to mention these naturalization acts of 1870 and 1906, mainly 1870. We'll start with that one first. Now, this Naturalization Act of 1870 limited the people who could naturalize, people who could become American citizens, to either white aliens or people of African descent. So in 1870, we have legislation that said you had to be white or of African descent in order to become an American citizen. Now, this is before that Chinese Exclusion Act, which said that people of Chinese descent or Chinese immigrants could not become citizens, right? So this is already in place before that. The problem is, how do we define white? Are Chinese people white? Are Japanese people white? Are Hispanic people white? Who is white? Who is not white? Well, we've already legislated, or we've already decided in 1848 that Hispanic people, no matter how dark they are considered legally white in the United States, right? We've decided in 1882 with all certainty that Chinese people could not become citizens, and they usually wouldn't be able to get it anyways because they generally wouldn't be considered white. Japanese people would make the argument that they're not the same as the Chinese people, and that they were white. So there are some cases in which Japanese immigrants were naturalized, arguing that they were white. But as we go forward, it's going to be much more difficult for Asians to become white, and there will eventually be a court case that will say that Japanese people were not white. So that will eventually happen by the time we get into the early 1900s. So Japanese people eventually will be declared by the courts that they are not white. So kind of keep that in mind. So as we go in the early 1900s, if Japanese people are not legally considered white, then they cannot become naturalized U.S. citizens. So the 1906 legislation just added that you had to speak English. So in order to become an American citizen, you had to speak English, and you had to be either white or black, basically, white or American, or African descent, anyways. Now we'll go on to the Issei and Nisei. Now, these Japanese immigrants start coming in fairly significant numbers as we go into the 1890s. So essentially the way this worked is we banned Chinese immigration in the 1880s, 1882, and the Chinese immigration. The reason we wanted or liked, the reason some people liked having the Chinese immigration earlier on was to basically serve as low-wage labor, primarily in agriculture, farmers, basically. So when we banned these immigrants, then agriculturalists, mainly in California, say we have farms, we have grapes that need to be picked and fruit, and we need more cheap labor to do that for us. So they start opening up immigration to Japan from the Japanese people, which is why you see this number of Japanese immigrants grow from like what 2,000 in 1890 to 24,000 by 1900. By 1910, we have over 72,000 people of Japanese descent. Now, this is not a table of immigrants. This is a table of people by non-white race. These numbers, when you get to the hundreds of thousands, then we're not saying that's how many immigrants there are. It's saying how many people of Japanese descent there are. And we'll come back to that 126,000 when we get to World War II, by the way, too. So we'll go over here. So basically, when we get to 1910, and we have 72,000, most of that 72,000 came between the mid-1890s and 1907. They come over like between a 10 and 15 year period of time, not a very big span of time. And in 1907, of course, we have that gentleman's agreement where Japan says they will no longer allow Japanese people to come to the United States as a favor to Teddy Roosevelt. So remember, Roosevelt has that agreement where we are not going to allow Japanese people to come over anymore. So keep in mind that these Issei cannot become American citizens based upon that Naturalization Act of 1870. Now the Nisei are American born, and the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution says that if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. So there's going to be a big legal separation between Issei and Nisei. Issei cannot become citizens. Nisei are citizens. But keep in mind that the Nisei aren't going to be around until we get to around early 19, very late 1890s or early 1900s, right? Yeah, that Japanese population has to move here first, then they start having babies, and then over time they'll grow up, right? So keep in mind that most of the Nisei, the American-born children, aren't going to start showing up in large numbers until you get to around 1900, right around that time frame. That's significant when we get to this California Land Law Act of 1913. So we get to this California Land Law Act of 1913. This is referred to as the Webb-Haney Act. This law passed in California, and it prohibited aliens who were ineligible for citizenship. So if you're a Chinese immigrant, and specifically a Japanese immigrant, because remember, by this time, it's been 30 years since they've even allowed Chinese people over. So if you're an alien, ineligible for citizenship, you could not own agricultural land, nor could you maintain a long-term lease over it. So basically, what this is saying is that essentially when the Japanese people came over, they started off as low-wage migrant laborers in the 1890s, but by the early 1900s, they started building up their own farms. And so by the time we get to 1913, a lot of those Japanese immigrants are no longer low-wage migrant laborers, but instead they are competition for the existing white farmers that were already there. And the white farmers in California did not want that competition. So they encouraged legislators in California to pass this law to remove the Japanese population from being competition by saying that Japanese people cannot own agricultural property in California. So they passed this law. Now, when this law passed, just to give you an idea, because a lot of times laws pass and they barely pass, right? And then you can just overturn it pretty soon after that if it wasn't a very popular law in the first place. This law passed 35-2 in the Senate and 72-3 in the Assembly, which is like the House for California. This law passes overwhelmingly. Now, after California passed this Webb-Haney Act, this Land Law Act of 1913, Texas, Arizona, Washington, Louisiana, Montana, Oregon, Idaho, and New Mexico all passed similar laws. You don't have to know all those states. Just understand that it's not just California. Basically, anywhere that you see a substantial Japanese population start to rise up, you're going to see a similar law passed that's going to keep Japanese immigrants from owning land because they cannot become naturalized citizens. So California Land Law Act passes in 1913, but the Japanese people don't give up. You're going to see a way to get around this. Just out of curiosity, see if you guys can figure out how are the Japanese people going to get around this. If you own a farm, let's say a 20-acre farm, you don't want to be a migrant farmer and you don't want to lose your farm, then how might you be able to keep your farm if you're not a Japanese immigrant? I'm sorry, if you are a Japanese immigrant. How are you going to be able to keep a farm? Who can give me an answer for that? Lease it, have anchor babies. The anchor babies, that's your Nisei, but they're not old enough yet. Remember, they're all coming around 1900, and if you're only 12, 13 years old, you're not going to be able to own the property. Lease it, you can lease it for brief periods of time. You can't do a long-term lease according to this law, but you could lease it for a year or two at a time. That's possible. You don't really want to invest very heavily in a sizable farm if you're just leasing it, because at some point that lease may not be renewed. You may get kicked off the land, and then somebody else is going to benefit off of it. So that could play a role. How else might you be able to do it? Let me ask you this. How is it that Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, how are they able to grow their businesses? What is it that they used? Holding company would be after the fact. They will use holding companies, but before they have holding companies, what do they have? here's my answer. Corporations. So if you, as a Japanese immigrant, cannot own your own farm, what you could do is create a corporation, own stock in the corporation, and the corporation then owns your farm instead. So you individually won't own the farm, but you'll own stock in the company that does. So you're like this, large groups of Japanese immigrants who are going to combine forces, essentially create corporations, corporate entities that are then going to own the farms. You still own your farm, but not by name through the stock that you own in that company. So these Japanese immigrants are going to use corporations and stocks in order to maintain control and keep the farms that they own. Another way they would do it is to bring in a lawyer. The lawyer would then act as an agent. So what you do is you sign off ownership of your land to the lawyer, but you also have a contract with the lawyer that says that you get to keep the farm, basically forever. You get to be able to operate the farm and reap the profits, and maybe you give the lawyer like a stipend or something like that. So you could have some kind of legal agreement where the lawyer serves as an agent who owns the property, and you still get to profit off that property, and it's basically just like you own it without having a long-term lease. So you're going to have a couple of ways of getting around that. So the Japanese population is going to continue to be successful going up to 1920. And the California legislature saw what happened. They realized that the Japanese population was able to get around that Webb-Haney Act. So they go back to the drawing board and they pass a new law. And at this point, they get rid of the long-term lease on. The 3-year lease was the highest they could have. And they then passed a law in 1920 that said the Japanese people were no longer allowed to own stock in companies that owned agricultural land. So they've passed the 1913 law that said Japanese people can't own the land themselves. Now they're passing a law saying that Japanese people can't even own stock in a company that owns agricultural land. Now, this would go to the United States Supreme Court in 1923, and the United States Supreme Court would uphold this law in 1923 and again in 1946. And for those lawyers who signed up as agents, they now have to give an annual report of what's going on with the land so that California can keep track of that going forward as of 1920. So California again tries to exert control over the Japanese population, but now we're at 1920, and that's where the kids are generally going to be old enough to start taking over the family farms, because by this time they are citizens since they're born here, and now they're 18, 19, 20 years old, maybe a little bit older than that. So now the Nisei can step in and save the family farm. So this will become significant. That's the main distinguishment between the Issei and Nisei. Now we'll move on. Oh, the Cable Act of 1922. I forgot about that. I will also say this, that the United States Congress, so the federal government, passed the Cable Act in 1922. And the Cable Act is mainly targeted at the Japanese people. What it says is that women who married aliens who were ineligible for citizenship would lose their citizenship. So if you have a Nisei, for example, an American-born child who marries a Japanese immigrant or any other immigrant who's ineligible for citizenship, then they would lose their citizenship, which meant they couldn't own the family farm either, right? This would, of course, apply towards white women as well. This only applied towards the women who married the alien. If a man, let's say a white man, married a Japanese immigrant woman, he did not lose his citizenship. This would only apply towards the women. So that Cable Act of 1922 is put in place. It'll be there for 14 years. It'll be repealed in 1936. But for 14 years in the United States, a woman who married an alien who was ineligible for citizenship would lose their citizenship just by marrying that person. Now we'll go down to the Filipinos. So we have these Japanese issues. Now we'll go over to the Filipino issues. And when we look at this, again, this table over here shows the total non-white population in the United States. Now, bear in mind, people of Mexican descent were considered white. So here's your African-American population. Here's your Indian population. When they're saying Indian, they're saying Native American. They're not saying Indian. They're saying Native American population. Then here's your Chinese population. Here's your Japanese population. And here's your all other races. Now, all other races is where you're going to find the Filipinos. This is, so you're going to see what Filipinos, your Hindus, what they listed. So that's going to be mainly people from India, Korean, Polynesian, other Asians. That's where you're going to see that column. Most of that 50,000 by the time we get to 1930 is going to be Filipinos. So we see this influx of Filipinos for obvious reasons, right? The Filipinos were coming over after the American Filipino War, the American-Philippine War, rather. The Philippines are part of the United States at that time, so that means that they can traverse freely through the United States since it's part of the empire. They wouldn't necessarily have citizenship since they're not born in the United States property. They're part of a territory, but they can travel back and forth across the empire, right, across the Pacific to the United States. So we're going to see those numbers really escalate as we go through the 1920s, right? Between 1920 and 1930, most of that number from 9,500 to 50,000, most of that is going to be Filipino immigrants. And as a result of this rising number of Filipinos who come to the United States, we're going to see backlash, racial violence. The word that starts with an N, that has a very negative connotation against African Americans, was also used against Filipinos. They were called the same name that African Americans were called in a derogatory manner. So there was a lot of racial violence, including lynching against Filipinos, mainly in the Pacific Northwest. So you're going to see a rise of these riots between 1927 and 1934. Oftentimes you'd see this when like Filipinos would go to like theaters. Oftentimes it'd be at like theaters where you'd see Filipinos try to go to a theater, whites would try to keep them out, and that would lead to a violent confrontation. So since we see a rise of these Filipino riots between 1927 and 1934, the federal government has to figure out a way to address this rioting and address the violence. So their way, what they decided to do to reduce the violent conflicts between Filipinos and white Americans is they passed the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934. The Tydings-McDuffie Act virtually eliminated immigration from the Philippines, and it called for self-government in the Philippines after 12 years. So basically, we want to keep Filipinos out so badly that we are going to give the Philippines their independence. So in 1946, we will grant the Philippines their independence. And the main reason we're doing that is because we want Filipinos coming to the United States. That's the sentiment in 1934 when they passed this legislation. They reclassified Filipinos with this legislation as aliens. So despite the fact that the Philippines is still part of the United States in 1934 and up until 1946, people from the Philippines were classified as aliens even though they're part of the American Empire. And then you can see that we are going to greatly reduce the amount of people who are allowed to come to the United States, which is why between 1930 and 1940, the number of Asians, mainly Filipinos, drops. From 1930 to 1940, you actually see a reduction in the number of Filipinos in the United States. We are also going to be repatriating them. We're going to start shipping Filipinos back to the Philippines because we don't want them in the United States. That's going to be the consensus amongst much of the white population in the 1930s. So that's the issues that Filipinos have. And then we'll move on to Mexicans. Do I have that? Okay. Now, we've already talked some of the Mexican issues with the Mexican Revolution. Now, this does spread, the sentiment does spread to the United States. A lot of people who were involved in the Mexican Revolution would make their way into Texas in order to escape violence. So sometimes they were revolutionaries themselves. They were getting close to being caught, and they would cross the border into Texas and seek refuge here. Some would go to El Paso. In fact, what's his name? Victoriano Huerta, the guy that was removed from power in 1914, he actually died in El Paso or around Fort Bliss somewhere. But they would come to El Paso, and a lot would wind up going to San Antonio. In fact, I think probably more went to San Antonio than El Paso long term, because El Paso is right there at the border. But we will see this influx of Mexican immigrants coming in, some of them directly because of the revolution. What you're going to, and I already talked about the racial violence against Mexicans, right? I talked about the Cortina Wars in Brownsville, Texas. There was already some sort of lynching. If you look at lynching records in South Texas and compare them to lynching of African Americans between 1877 and like 1930, the numbers are pretty comparable. It's basically more Mexicans were lynched in Texas between 1877 and 1930 than percentage-wise than you would see in like I think like Georgia. I think we probably had Georgia beat. We've not Mississippi or Louisiana or Alabama. I think those numbers were higher for African Americans, but some of the other southern states that weren't quite as violent, you would see some population right in there, percentage-wise. So we had this. We already had some lynching. This is really going to escalate in 1915. This will escalate, especially after this plan of San Diego is released. Now, San Diego, Texas is this very small town way down in South Texas. And there was a small group of revolutionaries who'd met down there, and they drafted this plan on which they wanted to create a new nation. And I have, on this PowerPoint that I'm showing here, a rundown of their plan. This is going to be what they argued. So the first point, on February 20th of 1915, they are going to say that we're going to lead an uprising against the United States government to proclaim the liberty of blacks from the Yankee tyranny that had held them in iniquitous slavery since remote times, and to proclaim the independence of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California, of which states the Republic of Mexico was robbed in a most perfidious manner by North American imperialism. So in February of 1915, this small group of men draft this plan to declare Texas to California to be independent of the United States. They would free the people of African descent. Part of this plan of San Diego was to join together the Asian people out west, so like the Japanese people in particular would be combined. They would also be seeking for the freedom of the Apaches of Arizona, right, the Native Americans. And I'm going to point this part out. So basically what they want to do is create an independent country that consisted of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans would all have the political power and citizenship. And then every North American white male over the age of 16 would be put to death. So every able-bodied man would basically be killed if they didn't leave the country. That's part of the plan of San Diego. The children shall be respected, the old people would be respected, the women would be respected, and so forth. So let's see. Ultimately, what they want to do, though, is try to join that independent country back with Mexico later on. You know, remember, they're in the midst of this revolution, so that wasn't really the time to do it. So that's, let's see, go back here. So that's the plan of San Diego. It's released. Remember, that's going to be in 1915. Word gets out that this plan has been released and that Mexicans are going to be looking, some Mexicans, this is a very small number, are going to be looking for an independent country, which means they're going to be revolting against the military in Texas. So in response, you're going to see a rise of these Texas Rangers. Remember, the Texas Rangers were established in the 1800s to protect settlers from Native American attacks. Now these Texas Rangers are going to be out there to protect from possible Mexican threats. Now bear in mind, this was originally Mexican territory, so there are a lot of Mexicans down in South Texas. So these Texas Rangers rise up and they start attacking Mexicans. In 1915 alone, they kill around 300 Mexicans, at least. That's a conservative number, 300. Some would estimate that around 1,000 Mexicans were killed between 1915 and 1916. Right, this photo right here was taken of 3 Texas Rangers with 4 dead Mexican bodies. These Mexicans had been lynched in South Texas, and you can see these Texas Rangers proudly posing for this picture. So you see a rise of racial violence against Mexicans in South Texas in particular. Now, over time, this violence will spread out. So by the time you get to like 1930, the number of Mexicans lynched is very likely over 1,000 and possibly as high as 5,000. So we see lots of Mexicans killed, primarily by Texas Rangers. And when we're talking about Texas Rangers, we're talking about loyalty Rangers. These are basically very poorly trained Rangers who basically volunteered to serve, basically so they could go out and attack Mexicans. So we have this racial violence rising up. Again, this is in response to the Plan of San Diego. And also keep in mind that in 1915 and early 1906, that's when Pancho Villa attacked the that American-owned mine in northern Mexico, and in 1916 attacked Columbus. So a lot of these Texas Rangers are kind of tying Pancho Villa's attacks against Americans in Mexico and the United States to this Plan of San Diego. There was no real relationship between the two, but because of Pancho Villa's violence combined with that Plan of San Diego, you see this very aggressive attack against Mexicans in South Texas. Now, again, we do see a large number of Mexicans immigrate to the United States in the 1920s, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. So when they're coming here, they're coming to an atmosphere that is very violently against Mexicans in large areas. Mexicans would be segregated. So you will have what we often call Juan Crow laws, right? Talk about segregating of African Americans in the South. We call them Jim Crow laws. When we talk about segregating Mexicans in Texas in particular, we call them Juan Crow laws. So we have these laws put in place where you're going to kind of segregate Mexican people. You'll have like restaurants and businesses that will say no Mexicans allowed in their front sign. Even if you go to like Fort Worth, Texas, just to give you an example. In Fort Worth, Texas, there's a restaurant that many of you may already be familiar with, Joe T. Garcia's. Joe T. Garcia's was established, I think, in the 1940s, if not mistaken. And when they first opened, they would not allow Mexicans to eat in the dining room if there were white people around. Mexicans, even though this is a Mexican-owned business, Mexicans had to go to the kitchen to get their food, and they couldn't eat in the dining room. They might be able to eat in the kitchen, or they could take it to go, but they weren't allowed to eat in the dining room because the dining room was reserved for white people. All right, so even in Fort Worth in the 1940s and 50s, you would see segregated restaurants against Mexicans. You'd also see segregated schools. In South Texas, you often saw, actually all over Texas and all over the American Southwest, you would see segregated schools. Fort Worth itself had 2 segregated Mexican schools that were established. One in the 1920s. The school didn't even have a name. It was called the Mexican School. I saw a map of it in the late 1920s, and every school from the Fort Worth School District had a name except for that, and all they had on it was an M with a circle, and that was the Mexican School. That school closed down in the 1930s, and then just a year or 2 later, they built a separate school called Katy Lake Elementary, and that was in South Fort Worth. The first one was built where the Tarrant County College Trinity River campus is now. It's right around that Henderson and Belknap area. The second one was built in South Fort Worth, right off Seminary. If you're familiar with South Fort Worth or Fort Worth in general, then you know where La Gran Plaza is right around that area, is where Katy Lake Elementary was. So segregated schools did become the norm as we go to the early 20th century, and really all the way up until the mid 20th century. So as we see segregation and this violence against Mexicans, we're going to see a rise of civil rights organizations also. So the African American population, we've already discussed in NAACP. For Mexicans, we're initially going to look at a group called LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. LULAC was established in 1929 in Corpus Christi, Texas. This image here would show the very first, the founding members of LULAC. LULAC had a lot of lawyers. Now, when they create the civil rights organization, they will be fighting for civil rights for Mexican Americans based upon the whiteness, right, the legal whiteness of Mexicans. Right? When African Americans are fighting for civil rights, they're fighting for rights based upon their blackness. Right? They're saying that people of color should have the same rights as white people. What Mexicans are saying is that we deserve the rights that we should have as being white people. So basically, people of Mexican descent are saying we deserve rights that black people don't have. Right? That's going to be the initial argument that we're going to see in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, really all the way up until the 1960s. When we get to the 1960s, that argument's going to change for the most part. But understand that LULAC is established, and we'll talk more about LULAC and Mexican American civil rights when we get to the civil rights lecture, of course. Now we'll push back to the African American population. As a result of this great migration, with these African Americans coming up to the north and building these new communities, you'll have this cultural renaissance. We're going to see this convergence of African American cultural, academic, social leaders, civil rights leaders, all meeting together in New York City. And there's a part of town called Harlem that is the historic part of town, the historic black part of New York City. So in the 1920s, we're going to see all these different people and many more combine or converge and share ideas and kind of lead this movement, this idea that African Americans have a lot more to contribute than what the white population has allowed them to do up to this point. So we'll play a little bit of some of these guys. I'm going to play Langston Hughes first. I'm going to share with you a screen. Now, Langston Hughes was really the poet of the Harlem Renaissance. He was a social activist. He wrote some plays also. He was a young man at this time. I believe he was born in 1901, if I'm not mistaken. So he's just a teenager when the 1920s started. And he's going to have this poem that I'm going to play for you called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So I'm going to play this. Let me go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see this. On my YouTube side, I think you guys will probably be able to hear this. I'm not going to share the screen on that side just to save a little of my trouble since you don't really need to see it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me just a moment.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man. He went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Okay, so that's the Negro Speaks of Rivers. That's the Langston poem. It's a well-known poem. Let me. I'm not going to go back to my PowerPoint just yet because we're going to play some other clips, I think. But Langston Hughes, of course, with that poem, he's really what he's saying is that we aren't confined and defined by where we are now and who we think we are or who we are told we are, right? We African American people have this long history of power, culture, and knowledge, right? When you take history of Western civilization, where do you start? Do you start in Europe? Do you start in America? No, you start in the Middle East. You start in the Euphrates. You talk about the Nile River. You might go to the Congo River, right? All of these are significant areas when you're talking about the history of mankind. So essentially what you're saying is that the white or European population didn't start everything, right? They're building off of what the people of African descent created. And it's from that knowledge and wisdom that the European people kind of grew. The African people also progressed, but this Eurocentric way of looking at life and education and academia is ignoring the whole other world. So it's kind of instilling this idea of cultural pride and identity, remembering who the people of African descent were as a people, right? So Langston Hughes is going to be doing that. Alan Locke was the next name. Again, I'm not going to pull my PowerPoint up right now. My YouTube side, it's still available. But Alan, of course, was spelled A-L-A-I-N, A-L-A-I-N, Locke, L-O-C-K. Alan Locke is sometimes referred to as the father of the Harlem Renaissance, a very intellectual man. In fact, he was the first African-American to be awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. So he's the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S. If you don't know what a Rhodes Scholarship is, to be a Rhodes Scholar means that you're given a scholarship to attend Oxford University. Oxford University may be the best, finest university in the world. Right? Normally when you say what are the greatest universities in the world, Oxford and Cambridge and maybe some of the Ivy League schools come up in the conversation. But Oxford is a fantastic school. There's a small number of people on a yearly basis that are awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, and Alan gets that. So he goes to Oxford, and then he comes back and he graduates from Harvard with degrees in literature and philosophy. So he is kind of a philosopher and literary figure of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote a book called The New Negro. So this book called The New Negro was an anthology of stories, poems, and essays on African American art and literature. And he distinguishes in this book between the old Negro, what he called the old Negro, and the new Negro. The new Negro has this burgeoning assertiveness and self-confidence in the years following World War I. Right? Before World War I, the way he would describe the old Negro is by basically saying that African Americans worked as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They worked in low-wage jobs, and they were essentially learning skills from institutions like the Tuskegee Institute. After World War I, you have African American World War I veterans who have now fought for the freedom and liberty of a country, and they come back to this country and they're not treated equally, and they're not treated like heroes the way they feel like they should have been treated. So now they're going to be fighting for the power that they've earned, right? At the same time, you have African Americans moving to cities in the World War I era and getting jobs, and they have a taste of what it's like to have success. And nobody wants to feel success and feel failure.
You only want to continue to feel success and gain more and more power. So Alan Locke is describing this evolution of African Americans in his point of view in the 1920s. We also have a rise of African American musicians that rise up in the 1920s and early 1930s. Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald are all going to be part of this Harlem Renaissance movement from the 1920s and 30s. Ella Fitzgerald's going to be more of a 1930s figure, but they'll be part of this. And then we'll have Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was a folklorist and writist who was part of the Great Migration also. She was from Florida originally. She moved up to New York, and she wound up attending Barnard College, which was sort of Columbia University. So she's basically attended the women's school for Columbia University, and she was the first African American admitted into Barnard. So she was a very well-educated, very highly respected African American woman. She pursued her studies in anthropology while she was there, and she started writing novels. When she would write novels, she would describe African American pride and power in the face of a civilization that tends to try to put down African Americans. So despite the fact that they aren't able to get the jobs and political power that they want or haven't been able to get to this point yet, they still are building these communities with a great deal of pride in what they are doing and who they are. So she's really kind of putting forth this idea of pride within the African community in the 1920s. We're going to bring up Zora Neale Hurston again later on too. Make sure you know who she is though. 1920s, we have the Harlem Globetrotters rise up as well. The Harlem Globetrotters, I'm not going to say anything about them. I like to put them on there because it's hard to believe that they've been around for 100 years, but it's been just about 100 years. I think they were founded like in 1925 or 26. W.E.B. Du Bois was part of this also. W.E.B. Du Bois, I've already mentioned a few times. He is in New York City. He is working for the NAACP. All this information that is coming to New York, he is sharing what he knows, and he's sharing what he's learning with the American public through the Crisis magazine, working for the NAACP. And then we have Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey States. He was actually from Jamaica. He came to the United States, I believe, in 1916. Make sure I get that right. 1916. Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Garvey in just a minute because I forgot I've got him on the next slide. So I'm going to come back to Garvey. Let's go ahead and go to Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson is a guy. I'm trying to think of. Yeah, I'll skip this. I'm going to pull that PowerPoint back up in just a minute. But Paul Robeson he's a guy that says, I look at him and say, well, I wish I was more like that guy. Not necessarily because I agree with everything that he says and believes, although he makes sense with what he says. But he was an African-American man who went to Rutgers University in New Jersey on academic scholarship. So he first attended Rutgers on academic scholarship. So you know he's a smart guy, right? If you get a full academic scholarship to university, you're doing pretty well. You're pretty smart. While at Rutgers, he played football. In fact, he was a first-team All-American football player while he was at Rutgers. So not only was he really smart, but he was a great athlete. Now, after graduating Rutgers, when he graduated from Rutgers, he was a valedictorian. So he graduated as a valedictorian from Rutgers, and he went on to play professional football. Now, bear in mind, professional football was not very popular in the 1920s. Professional football doesn't really become popular in a large scale until we get to the late 1960s with the Super Bowl era. So he's professional football. He doesn't make there. He does some coaching also, but the main reason he's playing football is so he could pay his way through law school. He attended Columbia University for law school, and he wound up getting a law degree from Columbia. So he's a guy that went to Rutgers on academic scholarship, was a first-team All-American football player, graduated valedictorian, went on to be a professional football player and coach, and then graduated from Columbia University School of Law, which is one of the best law schools in the country. So he's just a fantastically intelligent and athletic man, but he's not really known for any of that stuff. What he's known best for is being a performer. He was an actor and singer. He was a Broadway star, and he performed in London also. By the time we get to the mid-1930s, people all around the world are going to know who Paul Robeson is. I'll play just a clip of Paul Robeson. We are going to come back to Paul Robeson when we get to the civil rights lecture as well. I'm going to play a clip of Paul Robeson just so you can see him performing a little bit. He was a stage actor and singer. What he's best known for in acting is Othello, right? He was one of the best known Othellos in Broadway history. Othello being that Shakespearean play, of course. But let me go ahead and play Paul Robeson. This is going to be from a movie called Showboat that came out in the 1930s. So again, most of his acting is going to be on stage, but he did perform in this movie called Showboat. And let's go back to my screen. And again, I'm going to just play this on the Blackboard side, not on my YouTube side. You'll be able to hear him perform on the YouTube side, but you'll be able to see the whole thing with the sound on the Blackboard side. So let me go ahead and share this.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man that I'd like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old Man River, that old man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along. He don't plant potatoes, he don't plant cotton. Them that plants them is soon forgotten. But old man River, he just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that pot, lift that pail, you get a little drunk and you're lying in jail.
Okay, so that is a clip. Let me stop sharing that real quick. So that is a clip from Showboat, again, starring Paul Robeson as one of the stars. Let me go ahead and get my PowerPoint back up now. Actually, yeah, I'll go and pull it back up, although I will be sharing my screen again in just a minute when I get to Marcus Garvey. So let me get back to that screen in case you needed to write their names down again. Okay. So that was Paul Robeson. The asterisks are the ones that you'd want to know. I'm not going to test or quiz on Billie Holiday, and I won't mention the Harlem Globetrotters. But the others you'd probably want to be somewhat familiar with. Actually, I don't think Ella Fitzgerald will show up on this since she really doesn't come until the 1930s, so she probably won't show up. Now let's go ahead and move back to Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey came from Jamaica in 1916, and he's going to be mainly around New York, this Harlem Renaissance era, from around 1916 to around 1923, 24, something like that. And he pushes for this, what he calls a back to Africa movement. He believes that people of African descent around the world should unite, go back to Africa, and take power away from European countries, right? I showed that map at the Berlin conference earlier, right? There's Ethiopia and there's Liberia. Liberia was established by the United States. It's not that big of a country. We're not going to be too concerned about that. But Ethiopia has withstood pressures from European countries and maintained its independence despite the fact they have been attacked by Italy in the past, right? And they're surrounded by other European countries or colonies. So Marcus Garvey says that we need to take the power back. You all need to go back to Africa and claim what is rightfully ours. So he encouraged the separation of races. He argued that black is beautiful. He argued for black power. When we get to the 1950s and 60s, and we get to like Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X that we'll talk about at that point, they're building on something that Marcus Garvey's already talked about in the 1920s, and he's actually building on something that was talked about by a couple other guys named Marvin Delaney and Henry Highland Garnett from earlier on. But don't worry about those 1800s guys. Marcus Garvey is going to be pushing this Back to Africa movement, trying to empower African Americans and really give people of African descent pride around the world. Now, basically, his point of view is that the white man was bad, right? If we consider the white man evil or bad, why would we want to be in a country that's filled with white people? That's going to be his argument. So people of African descent should go back to a place where they can maintain power, run their own governments, and do what they want to do the way they want to do it. So you have like a series of businesses, factories, cruise liners, stuff like that. He's often referred to as the Black Moses. This idea of people of African descent going back to their homeland is compared to Moses. If you're familiar with the Old Testament account of Moses freeing the Jewish people from 400 years of captivity in Egypt to go back to Israel, that's this idea of Marcus Garvey freeing the African people of African descent around the world, mainly in the United States for us, and going back to Africa and giving them their power there in their own land. This is a very popular movement. He had somewhere around 4 million members. People who followed Marcus Garvey were called Garveyites. Marcus Garvey's Garveyites, when they followed him, they were pushing for this idea of separation, and they will lead up to Malcolm X. In fact, Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites themselves. They followed Marcus Garvey. Now, his organization is called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. So make sure you relate this idea of Back to Africa and that organization to Mark Garvey. I am going to play a clip of Marcus Garvey also. I'm going to play it muted on my YouTube side, just so you can see the words. Marcus Garvey does speak with a very thick Jamaican accent, so he may not be the easiest person to understand, because he also speaks very quickly. So he has a very fast tone of voice. He speaks with a great deal of energy. When you listen to him, you can easily see why it is that he would appeal to the masses with the energy that he puts forth when he speaks, that whole passion. So I'm going to let you listen to and read the words of Marcus Garvey in part of one of his speeches. So I'm going to set up my YouTube side real quick so that it's ready to go. Make sure my volume is turned down. And let me share my screen on this side real quick. Okay, and we will play Marcus Garvey.
Future for people who did not get past. My parents, my grandparents, my mother, my father did not suffer and die to give me an education. This life pressure discouraged my people. Because whatsoever education I acquired out of those sacrifices of over 300 years, I shall use for the salvation of the 400 million black people in the world. Then when I shall take my people, may God Almighty say there shall be no more light for you. I unequivocally rejected the racist assumption of much white American Christianity, namely that God has created the black man inferior and that he had intended Negroes to be a serpent fire, pure as wood and vials of water. The life dedicated my blood man and the doctrine of Imago Dei, all men regardless of color, are created in the image of God. Now from this premise follow the equality of all men and the brotherhood of all men. The biblical injunction of Acts 17:26 reminds us that he created the one blood all nations of men to God on the face of the earth. I was most interested in brotherhood within his own race, because if Negroes are created in God's image and Negroes are black, then God must in some sense be black. Man has the idea of a white God, let him worship his God as he desires. He has found a new ideal, because once our God has no color, and yet it is human to see everything through one's own spectacles, and since the white people have seen their God through their white spectacles, we have only now to give our God to our own spectacles. We believe in God of Ethiopia, the everlasting God, God of Father, God of Son, God of Holy Ghost, the one God of our ages. That is the God in whom we believe, but we shall worship him through the spectacles of Ethiopia. For 250 years, we have struggled under the burden and rigours of slavery. We were maimed, we were brutalized, we were ravaged in every way. We are men. We have hopes, we have passions, we have feelings, we have desires just like any other race. The cry is raised all over the world. Canada for the Canadians, of America for the Americans, of England for the English, of France for the French, of Germany for the Germans. We the black world to raise the cry of Africa for the Africans. The Negro is the man. We represent the Negro. This back is not yet against the world. We do not want his back against the world because God will be a peculiar and desperate position. We do not want him there. It is because of this that we will ask for fair compromise. The Belgians have control of the Belgian Congo, which they cannot use. They have not the resources to them. The French have more territory than they can develop. There are certain parts of Africa in which they cannot live at all. So it is for you to come together, give us a United States of Africa.
Okay, let's go back. I'm going to pull that PowerPoint back up again. Let me switch back over on my YouTube side as well. And so you can get a sense of what Marcus Garvey was bringing to the table, what he was proposing. Right? In fact, at the end, he makes the comment that they're not smart enough. Right? People of African descent, he's insinuating, if not outright saying, people of African descent are smarter than white people, is going to be his argument. Why are they in our territory if they don't even know what they're doing? That's basically what he's saying, right? So that's going to be the Marcus Garvey approach. Let me get my camera back on. Okay. Let me ask this question real quick. Remember, we've mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois before. Would we say that W.E.B. Du Bois supports Garvey? Do you think he would be supportive of Garvey in this Back to Africa movement, or do you think he would say that we don't like this Back to Africa movement? Okay, we'll respond from that point. We have 12 out of 16 people who've responded. 7 said he would not, 5 said he would support him. It's an interesting question. In the 1920s, W.E.B. Du Bois said the following. He said that Marcus Garvey was, quote, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world. He is either a lunatic or a traitor. End quote. So in the 1920s, W.E. Du Bois does not like this idea of Garveyism, right? W.E.B. Du Bois is looking for African American power in the United States, not a call of African people to go back, or people of African descent to go back to Africa. So he's not for that. Now, answering yes is not a bad answer. The reason I say that is because as time goes by, W.B. Du Bois is going to really start to lose hope in this idea of integration. And Du Bois himself will actually move to Africa and die there. So if you said yes, if we asked later on in his life, and I don't know what his response was in the 1950s and 60s, Du Bois was, I think, around 90 years old, pretty close to 90 years old when he died. Du Bois himself will go back to Africa. But in the 1920s, he's saying that Marcus Garvey was a traitor or a lunatic. Now, remember that. Every now and then you'll see on a quiz or exam or both this statement that Du Bois made about Garvey, that he's either a lunatic or a traitor, the most dangerous enemy to the Negro race. Right? That's going to be his description of Garvey in the 1920s. So make sure you know that. He is not in agreement, although later on in his life, you can see that he may have a little bit more of an agreement with Garvey's approach. Now, in the 1920s, we also see a rise of nativism. Right? We talked about nativism in the late 19th century. It's going to really escalate in the 1920s. This will also be part of that Red Scare, right? The Red Scare, with this idea of communists and anarchists coming to the United States and taking over. The biggest fear are communists and anarchists who are coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. These people who were maybe Catholic, maybe Jewish, maybe they were atheists. So we're going to have this rise of nativism, which isn't just going to be about or against African Americans. In fact, nativism will lead to the rise of what we call the second KKK, the second Ku Klux Klan. So the second Ku Klux Klan rises up in the 1920s, really builds up during and after World War I. And this is where the Ku Klux Klan sees its highest numbers. By the mid-1920s, there were somewhere between 4 and 5 million Ku Klux Klan members. So we have between 4 and 5 million Ku Klux Klan members in the 1920s. Now, again, in the South, when we're looking at states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Arkansas, right, that Ku Klux Klan in the Deep South is really about African Americans, right, disenfranchising and using intimidation and violence there. But the Klan in Texas is going to be a little bit different. There will be some of that violence against African Americans, but a lot of it's going to be like anti-Catholic, anti-Mexican. And then when we look at up in the North or the Midwest, you'll see a lot of anti-Jewish, anti-Eastern and Southern European, anti-Catholic, some of that anti-African American as well. Basically, the Ku Klux Klan in the mid-1920s is pushing for the United States to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So if you've ever heard the term WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, then they're probably going to be against you. Now, 40% of that Klan, right? I mentioned there's somewhere between 4 and 5 million Klan members in the United States by 1924. 40% were in these 3 states: Illinois, make sure I've got my hand highlighted, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. That's where the Klan is really the biggest. 40% of the Klan is in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Now, this map is color-coded, so the darker orange is the highest percentage of Klan. So if you look at like Oregon, Indiana, and Florida, over 5% of the state's population and up to 9% was in the Ku Klux Klan. So we have a very significant member of Ku Klux Klan members in those states. Now, when you're looking at Oregon, a lot of that Klan is rising up because of the Filipinos. When we're talking about the Filipinos moving to the United States, a lot of them went to Oregon, Washington, and California. Oregon had a bunch of those. So you're going to see the Klan really against that. We'll look at places like Indiana. It will be against African Americans, Jews, and Southern and Eastern Europeans. Florida, it's mainly against African Americans. But know that the Klan is not just against African Americans, it's against a bunch of other people too. Now, part of the reason the Ku Klux Klan rose to such numbers officially was because the person who was leading the Klan also owned a business that made uniforms for the Klan. So part of this was a financial incentive for the this leader of the Ku Klux Klan. He's making money basically off of selling uniforms. So it's in the 1920s that we see the traditional white uniform of cloak and robe that we see today, right? And that will lead this nativism and the rise of KKK leads to this National Origins Act of 1924. This is going to be other immigration legislation. Right? I mentioned, I think yesterday, that immigration legislation will become an issue when we get to the final exam. I mentioned today, it's a pretty good chance that you may see a question about women's advancements and evolution in the 20th century be a question. Here we're going to see another movement in this immigration legislation. We're going to use a 2% quota. So basically what Congress is going to do is they're going to meet together and they're going to say, when did the United States start to fall apart? When is it that the United States was a good country and we didn't have as many problems as we have today with racial violence, whether it be ethnic and racial violence between Eastern, Southern, and Western European people, or between African Americans and white Americans? So they go back to the census and say, we're going to look at the census and see what it looked like in years gone by. Remember, I mentioned that the murder rate grew by 250% between 1880 and 1900. So at first, Congress says, let's draw immigration legislation based upon the 1880 census. But then they decide, well, that's really too long ago, so we're going to use the 1890 census instead. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a 2% quota, so no more than 2% of the number of immigrants who are here, or people here from any of these countries by 1890 would be allowed in going forward. So if we look at, let's say, Greece and Italy, right? Those are two countries that we mentioned before where you saw the numbers really go up. When we looked at 1870, this last column is 1870, here's 1880, here's 1890. You can see in 1890 we had about 182,000 Italian immigrants in the United States, or Italians altogether. That number continues to escalate rapidly as we go through the 1890s and early 1900s. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that no more than 2% of that 182,000, which is less than 4,000. So on any given year, a few 100,000 Italians may have come in the United States in the early 20th century, but now we're going to cap that so no more than 4,000 Italians can come to the United States going forward beginning in 1920. Which is why you're going to see the numbers really drop as we go past the 1930s. We're going to say the same thing for people from Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Soviet Union. So these numbers were really big in the early 20th century. We're going to use that 2% quota based upon that 1890 number. So again, somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 capped from Poland or Soviet Union. I think I may have another. Let me see if I've got one more here quick. Oh, we're going to use Africa. Again, there weren't many African immigrants. The immigrants, the people that had come from Africa traditionally or historically came as slave labor. So not a lot of people were coming from Africa voluntarily to the United States. So since we only had 2,000 people from Africa in 1890, we're going to cap people of African descent all around to like 40, right? No more than 40 Africans. And remember, we've already barred Asian immigration. So after 1924, we're going to have a sharp limitation on people coming to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe, because it's really after 1890 that we saw those numbers become very big. Meanwhile, we're going to allow fairly significant numbers of people to come from Great Britain or Germany or Ireland. So from 1924 to 1965, the majority of immigrants are coming from the United Kingdom or Germany, France can come over if they want, but there's not going to be a whole lot of French immigrants coming over. And then we'll go over to, I think that's about it. So make sure you're familiar with that legislation in 1924. We will take our second break right now. We'll say 10 minutes, so 11:20 a.m. We'll pick back up, and we'll move on to the next part of the 1920s. We probably won't start the Great Depression today, but we'll finish off the 1920s and cover the Great Depression tomorrow. Again, 11:20, we'll start back up, so you guys have a 10-minute break to stretch your legs and do what you need to do, and we'll start back up then, okay?
Something deep inside me, hold on to me. Now I see, everybody hurts someday. It's okay to be afraid. Everybody hurts, everybody screams, everybody feels this way.
Every home has how-tos and probably some want-tos. People can help you too.
things you need to make things work a little better, or take care of something you've been meaning to do. Maybe do something to start somewhere. We have the low prices to make it all. Do a quick order online and get free delivery on orders over $45. Whatever you need to do or want to do, we can help you get it done. Build how doers get more done. So
The comforting repetition of waves. Wait, that's a muddy puddle splashing all over your clothes. Stains can ruin any moment. Get them out with Tide, America's #1 detergent. If it's got to be clean, it's got to be Tide. I can't take one step towards you. That's all that's waiting to come. Don't you know I'm not your ghost anymore? You lost the love of them all. Learn to live as a lie. Now you want me one more time. Who do you think you are? Running around the
Okay, all right, we are back. We will finish off the last 45, 50 minutes here and try to finish off the 1920s. We'll get pretty close if we don't get all the way there. I think I can probably cut short on a couple of items, and I think we should be able to finish it off. Let's go through this entertainment first. Remember, we have the rise of these big cities. There's more money, generally speaking, in the pockets of Americans as we get through the World War I era. World War I appeared to be very good for the American economy in some respects. Right, we really pushed forward a lot more manufacturing. We're providing weapons and materials to European countries, mainly England and France. We'll actually, I think I. So we've built a lot of money in manufacturing during World War I, providing for England and France and for the United States also. Our agriculture during World War I was also really good because keep in mind, all these farms in France are torn apart. There's a huge demand for American agricultural goods. So while farms were not doing all that well in the late 19th century, we start to do really well during World War I. Because now we're mass producing agricultural goods and there's an actual demand for those goods. The late 19th century was we're mass producing a lot of agricultural goods, but there's not really that big of a demand for it. So the economies would be doing a lot better. There's a lot more money in circulation, and we have these big cities. So this 1920s, we're going to see a rise of spectator sports following World War I. Now the main spectator sports in the 1920s were college football, professional baseball, boxing, and maybe track and field to an extent. Those are going to be your main sports that we follow in the 1920s and 1930s. Remember, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, isn't around yet. There is no NBA, and the NFL is fledgling. Right, it just started. I think it was. I think in 1919, I think they just had their 100th anniversary. It was really small, very few teams, and nobody really watched it. But college football, baseball, boxing, and track and field are going to be really the main sports people are following. So you're going to start seeing people go to these sporting events with the rise of city and a little more money in your pocketbooks. You'll also see a lot of people going to movie theaters. In the 1920s, the United States becomes the center of the movie world. We're producing movies for countries all over the place. If you go to England or France, anywhere in Europe for the most part, and you watch a movie, it's probably a movie made in Hollywood. You see the golden age of Hollywood rise up in the 1920s. Baseball's main hero is going to be a guy named Babe Ruth. He played for the New York Yankees for most of his career. Growing up, I loved baseball. I read a lot of baseball history books, so I could probably talk about Babe Ruth and the whole era for a long time, but we'll save you from that and just say that Babe Ruth drew millions of spectators. Just to give a little bit of context, before Babe Ruth, we had something dead ball era in Major League Baseball, and basically that meant that not many home runs were being hit. So when you think about a home now, well, back then the home run leaders for a full season would have like 10, maybe 8 home runs for an entire year. When Babe Ruth comes in the 1920s, he's hitting like 50 per year, with 60 in one particular year. So he really changed baseball and how we looked at baseball in the 1920s. He and a few other guys, Lou Gehrig and some other guys, Ty Cobb and some of these other guys. But Babe Ruth's the real big hero, and huge following for Babe Ruth. And then in boxing, we have Jack Dempsey. I'm going to show you the first round of a boxing match that Jack Dempsey had. Jack Dempsey was a very blue-collar guy, homeless for a period of time in the 19-teens, didn't come from much. He was a tan-complected guy. I'm going to show the video, and he looks fairly dark. He is white, but he's a tan guy. And in 1919, he won the heavyweight boxing championship against a guy named Jess Willard. I don't think I put Jess Willard on this exam or quiz. Just in case, though, Jess Willard is spelled Jess for Jess, Willard, Willard. And I'm going to show the first round of the match in which Jack Dempsey beat Jess Willard. Jess Willard was previously referred to as the Great White Hope because before Jess Willard took the heavyweight boxing championship, he won it from a guy named Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was an African-American boxer, very powerful guy that a lot of the white population did not like because he really challenged a lot of social norms, and he didn't really care if you didn't like him. So Jack Johnson was not very popular with the white population in the United States. So Jess Willard became a bit of a hero when he defeated Jack Johnson to take the title. And so Jess Willard will be the guy that's going to be fighting Jack Dempsey. Jess Willard was a big guy, not real muscular, but he was 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed about 245. Jack Dempsey was about 6 foot or 6'1". So you're going to see a sizable difference. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and again, we'll watch that Dempsey-Willard fight, at least the first round from 1919, to get a taste of what the American population was seeing or hearing, mainly on the radio at that point, although this will be actual footage from the fight. So let me share my screen real quick. It'll be just a moment. And I will play this on YouTube as well. You just want to pull that up on YouTube. So I'll play them simultaneously as we go forward.
From their corner, now you can see the bronze challenger seems almost puny next to the giant he's about to fight. They listen quietly, almost without interest, to a story they know by heart. Sweat-beading shoulders
Okay, all right. I think I lost you guys for just a minute. Let me make sure I've got that. Close that. Okay. I think I lost my internet connection for just a minute. Back online again. Make sure I'm being recorded. Just real quick, I'm going to send a message out. Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm going to try that again. I haven't reconnected, so I'm going to play that video all over. Be just a minute while I share that screen.
From their corners for induction. Now you can see what a difference there is in their size. Though a great athlete, the bronze challenger seems almost puny next to the giant he's about.
Okay, I'm going to give it one more try. If it doesn't work this time, then I'll just give up on it. But I'm switching back and forth between Wi-Fi and my phone. Let me go ahead and try this one more time and see if it works.
Anyhow, where's the bell? There it is. So the big fight begins. Just moves easily into action. The mahogany huge Dempsey circles, moving in and out with fat-footed quickness. The champion wants to keep Jack at long range with his poking left jab, but Dempsey won't let him do it. He's never still for an instant, bobbing and weaving around. It looks like a test of speed against power, and Willard has no chance to get set against Dempsey's speed. To face, there's a lot of messing and a lot of clinching. It's bound to be that way, but it's only a warm-up so far. Each is trying to figure out the other's defense, to open him up, nail him with a punch. The challenger crowd keeps on crowding. The instant he's in the open, he moves back again. His left in tirelessly and often. The blows miss or graze Willard. Dempsey hasn't the range yet. Just hold whenever he can, but that's Jack's meat. Nobody's strong enough to tie him up for long, and trying to hit him is like trying to get a sunbeam that moves away. Dempsey's hands are in motion all the time. Willard tries to block with gloves and forearms and elbows, but he compels constantly to retreat. What else can he do against the endlessly moving little man? When you're going away, you can't do much damage yourself. A champion is supposed to make the fight, but try as he will, it's far beyond Big Jet. But he hasn't been hurt yet. For all the charging, for all the blows, the tall Pine has suffered no injury. He's clever, knows how to handle himself, and in spite of his great size, he moves around quickly and gracefully. No, the little man won't get him. When he's out of the ring, now watch, there's that big left, and Willard's down. Up, sure he's up. Dempsey hurt him along the rope, beating away with both hands. There's that left again. Willard's on the floor for the second time. Champion stays, groggy, but he's game. He's up again. The fist coming on him. And down he goes. Falls along the floor like a wounded animal, crouching with his back half turned as he arrives. The more overwhelmed with this, there comes the fury that sends him to the floor for the fourth time. Dempsey stands for the stricken man. His fist back. The instant Willard knees were off the floor, Jack at him again. Just as wide open, he has absolutely no defense. And he hits the deck again. Courage, just plain courage, instinct, whatever it is, flying and staggering up to his feet. Willard wheels around the ring, powerless, with Dempsey pumping right and left into it. Clear across the outer corner, and there he takes it again. How can the man stand it? There he falls, gloved hand feeling the rope, trying to hold himself up. Then, painfully, he drags his racked body to a half-erect position. But a right smashes into his side. Other right cracks to the head, and Willard collapses into a sitting position, dazed and helpless, after the most murderous beating a man ever took in the ring. And there's the bell.
Okay. There we go. Should be back now. Get my camera back on. Okay, and you guys could see that, right? Can somebody just put a message real quick in the Blackboard, or in the Collaborate, in the chat? Just let me know if you were able to see that video. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So that was Jack Dempsey winning the title in 1919. Again, a very popular character in that 1919 fight. I believe somewhere around 50,000, something like that, attended the fight. Let me pull my PowerPoint back up on my YouTube side. Okay. Now he will hold the title until 1926. At that point, he'll lose the title in front of 120,000 people. 120,000 people went to see the fight, and another 60 million people listened to the fight on the radio. Right, the 1920s, we're really going to see the radio come into to most households by the time we get to the end of the 1930s. So Jack Dempsey's this really big hero as we go through the 1920s, especially the first part of that 1920s time frame. Now we'll move on to jazz music. I'm not going to say a whole lot about jazz music. Just understand that jazz music is something that becomes very popular in the United States. In fact, we'll mention Scott Fitzgerald in just a little bit. He refers to the 1920s as the Jazz Age. You can see an orchestra down here. This is a new form of music that rises up. Again, a lot of it's built off of African-American music, starting in Louisiana, and kind of builds up from there. So you will have a lot of African-American artists that will play a big role in this. And then we see modernism. Modernism rises up. In Europe, it starts really in the earlier part of the 1900s, like early 1900s, going through the World War I era. The United States will become much more popular following World War I. So for testing purposes, make sure you know that the horrors of World War I expedited the rise of modernism in the United States. A lot of times you'll see a question that'll be worded something like that. So make sure you know that World War I expedited the rise of modernism in the United States. Now, there's a poem. Now, Gertrude Stein was a modernist poet, and modernism is based upon three assumptions. So modernism is based upon three assumptions. The first assumption is that God does not exist. So this is a belief that God does not exist. Their argument that how could God possibly exist when you see all of the terror and violence and chaos around the world? That's going to be their argument. The second point, or second assumption, is that reality is not rational, orderly, or obvious. Remember, this is really bucking against social Darwinism, where you have kind of this scientific approach to viewing mankind with order and success. These people say there is no order, there is no rationalism, and it's not necessarily obvious. Reality is kind of a construct that's created artistically and physically. So that's going to be an assumption for modernism. The third one is social progress cannot be taken for granted. Again, this expedites after World War I because, right, we're talked about social Darwinism, which implies that things are getting better through an evolution of society, laws, political processes, religion, whatever. But then we have World War I, and millions of people die, and everything just kind of falls apart. We see a rise of racial violence after this, with fears of anarchism and communism. So you come back and say, well, things don't appear to be getting any better, right? How could we have a war this big with this much of effect if things are actually getting better? So we can't just take social progress for granted. We have to actually work towards it, because if you don't, it just falls apart. So those are kind of the tenets of modernism. Now, Gertrude Stein is a modernist poet and literary figure. She writes poetry and some books. In the classroom, a lot of times I'll show a poem that she wrote, and what she does is a lot of her poems don't really make much sense if you just read them. The words are kind of out of order. She'll have some things kind of emphasized. She'll repeat phrases and kind of twist words around, and it's not really so much about the narrative of the poem or the story. It's more about the words themselves and how they fit together, and it kind of makes you think. So she doesn't really sell well, but she didn't have to. She grew up pretty wealthy. She was a very intelligent person. She went to medical school for a brief period of time at Johns Hopkins University. If you know Johns Hopkins, you know that their medical school is one of the greatest medical schools in the country, if not the best medical school. So she's a brilliant individual, but since she had a lot of money, she really didn't have to work that much. She could kind of focus on what she enjoyed and what she was good at. She's going to wind up funding a lot of the arts. She'll wind up going to Paris, France, and spend much of her adult life in Europe, supporting literary figures along with artists like Pablo Picasso, for example. Speaking of, when we think of modernism, we generally think not only of literature, but mainly about art. So if we look at this, I'm going to give you some examples of paintings that were at this Armory show of 1913. So make sure you know this Armory show of 1913 was this exhibit that brought European art, modernist art, to New York City in 1913. This is often referred to as the most scandalous event in the history of American art. When we're talking about American art in the late 19th, early 20th century, we're kind of used to like landscapes and portraits, nothing too crazy. You know, if you see a horse, it's a horse. You see a mountain, it's a mountain. If you see a man working, it's a man working. Right? Now what we're going to see is a lot of utilization of color and abstract ideas that are related to modernism. So we'll see things like this, right? This is going to be one of the paintings. This is a Vasily Kandinsky painting that was portrayed at this exhibit. This would be a Henri Matisse painting. Here's another painting, and this is a Picasso painting. right? So all of these show up at this Armory show of 1913. And this is very, very different from what we're used to seeing. This is what's going on in Europe because, remember, Europe is war-torn and has been chaotic for a long time. And now it's become much more popular as we go in the 1920s, especially going into the 30s and 40s. Now, Gertrude Stein will host several literary figures from America when they go to Europe. Now, I usually spend a little bit more time on these literary figures, but I'm just going to quickly go through Sinclair Lewis, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Faulkner. I normally in class will talk about Main Street and Babbitt to an extent, a few minutes for each one. But what you want to know about Sinclair Lewis is that he's the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. So he'll be the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. He does that in 1930. Now, when Sinclair Lewis writes, he tends to be very critical of American materialism and the lack of culture. So that's really what he's doing. He's just criticizing the lack of culture in the United States and basically this push for material value. So again, I'm not going to describe Main Street and Babbitt to a lot of detail. I did read both of those books a few years ago. Essentially what it is, it criticizes how the United States tends to praise people based upon material success, even if that material success has nothing to do with contributions to mankind, right? These people are not artists, they don't provide any culture, they don't have any true skills, they can't build anything, they can't create anything, but you know how to talk and you know how to sell. So if you know how to sell and you know how to talk, you can make a lot of money and you're a success. You may not contribute anything to society, but you make money, and because you make money, you're a successful person, right? And then you show that success through buying material possessions that other people don't have. So Sinclair Lewis is very critical of this in the 1920s with books like Main Street and Babbitt, and several. Aerosmith would be another one. Now we'll go to F. Scott Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald, for test-taking purposes, make sure you know that he wrote this book, This Side of Paradise. Many, if not all of you, may be familiar with another book that he wrote called The Great Gatsby, since there have been a couple of movies. The more recent movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio that's based upon this book. And he also wrote a book of short stories earlier that refers to the 1920s or the coming of the 1920s as the Jazz Age. So make sure you know that F. Scott Fitzgerald is credited with calling the 1920s the Jazz Age. Now, he really wasn't the first person to call it the Jazz Age, but it becomes the Jazz Age, or people start calling it the Jazz Age because he used it in a book title earlier on. And then we have Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway, he was a reporter in World War I, tried to fight for the United States Army, but he failed a physical. He winds up getting injured while he's in Europe, and then he becomes one of the best-known literary figures in U.S. history. He will eventually win both a Nobel Prize in Literature and a Pulitzer Prize in Literature. So he winds up becoming a very successful author before killing himself. He'll wind up killing himself with a gun later on. There's disputes on whether or not he intended to kill himself, but he did wind up killing himself. And William Faulkner, we'll just mention him real quick. He's the Southerner. He was from Mississippi, and he tended to describe like race relations in the South. He'll stay in Mississippi for, I believe, his entire life, if I'm not mistaken, kind of going up to the Civil Rights era. So those would be some of the big literary figures, and Robert Frost, and there's a few others that are mentioned in your textbook on top of that. But these are the ones that I'm going to go over, just went over real quick. Now, this term, the lost generation, is often used to describe this group of literary figures in the 1920s. And make sure you know that Gertrude Stein is the one that called them the lost generation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, no, I'm sorry, Hemingway will actually use that term in one of his books. But Gertrude Stein is going to be the one that calls this group a lost generation, basically because this whole generation of writers became adults, became men at the time that World War I was going on. So the time that they really matured into manhood was a chaotic time of great loss. And she just felt like, or argued, that they were just a lost generation because things just looked so bad in the 19 teens. Now we'll just go through this economic boom in the 1920s leading up to the Great Depression. So we are going to say that there's what appears to be an economic boom in the 1920s. We'll look at this real quick. Your gross domestic product will be an indicator of how well your economy is doing overall. We see that there is a recession in 1920 to 21. Right? We see unemployment rise up, manufacturing goes down. Basically, we've been overproducing. So what happens is we are producing mass amounts during World War I, but then after World War I, we are still producing huge amounts of goods, but manufacturing is starting to come back in European countries. So then we're overproducing, and then we have to cut back on that and then push it back up. So we have this bit of a decline in 2021, but all the way up until 1929, you see pretty consistent growth in our economy using that gross domestic product as the measuring stick. So manufacturing is really going to drive it. Technology plays a big role. Radio becomes very prevalent by the time we get to 1930. Most households will have a radio. That'll play a big role going into the 1930s. Of course, road construction is very big because we're producing lots of cars, right? The Ford Motor Company, along with Chevrolet, are mass producing automobiles as we go through the 1920s. We look at this real quick to show the number of passenger cars manufactured in the United States in the 1920s. Just huge numbers. This number is in the thousands. So we're saying that, by 1929 we have 4.5 million automobiles manufactured in the United States. So the manufacturing of automobiles, along with this road construction and technology, washing machines, and other things like that, will be produced. A lot of these things will be household appliances that are going to help women who are staying at home, making some of the work easier for housewives in the 1920s. We will address this dip here. So if you look at 1927, you notice there's a considerable dip in the number of automobiles manufactured. That's when we stopped manufacturing Model T Fords. We're going to address that when we get to the Great Depression. We're going to come back to that part because that's kind of a sign that we're about to have an economic depression. Now, another thing that's going to drive the economy in the 1920s is commercialism. Right now, we're going to have print ads to large populations in urban cities, and we're going to have radios used to broadcast and advertise commercial goods. So it's going to lead to consumer culture. Consumer culture basically meaning that people are hearing about new inventions and devices, and you go out and you want to buy it because you hear about it. So when you do that, you're spending money, you're growing the economy, right? Mass culture will also contribute to this. Basically, what this means is that everybody's starting to buy the same thing, same places. So before the 1920s, you had like little mom and pop stores, and now you're going to start seeing like Walgreens and Woolworths grow as chain stores. So people are going to start going to chain stores instead of mom and pop stores because they hear commercials, and because these bigger stores can offer lower prices since they sell in volume and they buy in volume. You're also buying the same things. So you're buying the same appliances, the same toasters, you're buying the same refrigerators, you're buying the same washing machines. All right, that's mass culture. And you're also buying the same brand Kellogg's corn flakes. So people are buying the same things, and they're all being pushed to buy them through this advertising and consumer culture. Now, as we go through the 1920s, we will see the rise of welfare capitalism and the American plan. Basically, what this means is you're going to see union activity reduced in the 1920s. The federal government is working against organized labor. So the number of union members in the 1920s drops from 5 million in 1920 to about 3.5, maybe a little less than 3.5 million by 1929. More and more countries are offering welfare capitalism. Basically, what that means is that they don't want people to go to a union to demand goods. They'd rather bring their grievances and complaints to the company themselves. And then the company will institute paternalistic techniques, like, for example, giving paid vacation. So you're going to see these big companies now start to offer paid vacation to employees. They will start to raise wages to some extent. They will use their own company union. So it's a union that is basically has the same boss that you have. So instead of going to a third party and threatening to go on strike, you take your grievances to the company union, and the company union will take the grievances to management. And when it's all said and done, they're going to try to make you happy just to the point where you're not going to leave the company. So it's not going to be as effective as a union that will organize a walkout like that, but it will give some benefits. Now, when we get to the end of the 1920s and we get to that Depression, of course, having a lack of unions also means a lack of protection of jobs, which means you're going to have a lot of people laid off or terminated that would have been better protected had they been in an actual union. So understand that when we lose union representation by 1929, we're also losing protections for people who are employed. Now, we are pushing forward this American plan. The American plan is basically the open shop. That's going to be this idea that if you work for us, you don't have to join a union, and if you don't join a union, we'll be more willing to hire you. So keep employees from joining unions. A lot of companies would initiate these yellow dog contracts. The yellow dog contract is basically you signing this contract when you're hired, saying that you will never join a union, which means if you ever decide to join a union, they now have grounds for termination. So when you sign these yellow dog contracts, you are hurting union activity as we go through the 1920s. Now, we'll address prohibition real quick. Let's see, I think we've only got one slide after this, so we'll have time to finish this off. Now, remember, in prohibition, let's see, when we have prohibition, we are banning manufacturing, transportation, sale, consumption of alcohol, right? Let me pull this up real quick because I may want to ask a question. Let's see. Okay, so I asked a question in the chat. Aside from not being able to buy and consume alcohol, what other adverse effects would we have with prohibition? So that's the question I'm going to ask you right off the bat. What issues, what problems would we have as a result of prohibition of alcohol? So I'll give you guys just a minute to respond to that question. Black market, okay. Rise in riots. What do you mean by a rise in riots? If you could clarify what you mean by that. Why would there be a rise in riots? Okay. I guess you might compare that a little bit to what we're seeing right now with people who want to open up America, right? I understand that argument. Okay. Use of illegal substances because you're making them illegal, right, Talia? You're making things illegal. So that would be the case. Or are you talking about other illegal substances like drugs? Talking about like marijuana and stuff like that, I'm guessing, right? Okay. More because it's prohibited. Okay. They want to drink more because it's prohibited. That's yeah, that mentality does come along. You tend to want things that you can't have or you're told you can't have, right? That does come up. Black market is a good one. So that's where we're talking about bootlegging, right? You're going to see alcohol being poured over the borders. Now, Mr. Nguyen, who's really going to suffer as a result of bootlegging? And let's say people are buying alcohol and they're just enjoying themselves and they drink moderately, and let's say they're not driving. What's the problem with black market alcohol? And anybody can answer that. Very good, exactly. Perfect answer. That's exactly what I was looking for. So when we prohibit alcohol, we are also prohibiting taxes, right? We're removing taxes on alcohol. So the loss of liquor taxes is going to wind up dropping annual revenue for local government, state and federal governments by about 10%. We're going to see a 10% hit on our tax revenue because we prohibit alcohol, but alcohol is still out there. In fact, between 1920, before Prohibition, and 1929, when we're 9 years into Prohibition, we go from 15,000 legal saloons to 29,000 illegal speakeasies. Speakeasies are going to be your illegal bars that are operating with like secret messages and in places that are nondescript and not labeled. You may have to go there with the passphrase or something like that. Invitation only, perhaps. So we still have plenty of alcohol being consumed and manufactured. Right, it's not that hard to brew your own beer. It's not that hard to make your own wine. Right, the fermenting process is just a matter of boiling water with sugar and fruit and letting it sit for a long time, with mixing in some yeast and fermenting it for like 5 days, and boom, you've got alcohol. Right, you now have like a 15% alcohol substance. It may not taste that good, but if you just want alcohol, you can have alcohol. So it's not going to be that hard to manufacture or make your own beer or wine, not to mention moonshine or other whiskeys that people could make over time. So it's not going to end drinking. You're going to have all these home breweries. People are going to continue to drink. And the drawback is going to be you're going to wind up having a lot less tax revenue, and you're going to have a lot of people in prison. By 1930, 1/3 of all people in prison were in prison because of Prohibition. All these people that are selling, manufacturing, or bootlegging alcohol, right? All these people were being put in prison that would not have been criminals, 9 or 10 years earlier if they committed the same acts. So we're dropping down tax revenue and increasing cost because now we're having to pay for those people to be in prison, and we're going to have to pay for the police and judges and lawyers and everything else that are prosecuting these people, arresting and prosecuting them. So we're increasing costs while decreasing revenue. Right? It's very similar to the marijuana argument today, right? States that have legalized marijuana, are they really legalizing it because they all think it's really healthy and good for you? The legislators aren't doing that. The legislators are legalizing it because you can make billions of dollars a year in tax revenue if you can just sell marijuana legally. Right? Marijuana is already being sold in large volumes all over the place, and the government's not profiting off of it. But now the government can profit off it if you legalize it and tax it. So you have the same concept here. Now, the biggest criminal that we look at, or the main criminal that we look at during the 1920s, a guy named Al Capone. Right? Al Capone ran this crime syndicate out of Chicago during Prohibition. The main thing he's going to be doing is bootlegging alcohol illegally. In the 1920s, we're going to estimate that he brought in about $60 million per year. Remember, this is $60 million a year that is not being reported to taxes. And since he's not reporting that $60 million per year on taxes, and we know he's making a ton of money because of all the money he's spending, then we're going to wind up putting him away, not because of his bootlegging or other criminal activity or the murders, right? His his gangsters are thought to have been involved in somewhere around 300 murders. What's going to wind up putting him away in prison is tax evasion, right? He's a fraud. Right? He's basically going to make all this money in the 1920s and pay very little in taxes. So since he's not paying taxes and not reporting his income legally, then he's going to wind up being put in prison, and he'll eventually die in prison. We'll finish off with the Teapot Dome scandal. Barely mentioned in Hoover. Warren G. Harding became president after the 1920 election. Right, he wanted to bring back what he said. He wanted to bring back a sense of normalcy to the United States, right, through this time of chaos. So he comes in. He's fairly progressive. Like he actually endorsed a lot of civil rights, but we're not going to see any real significant legislation passed while he's president. And he allowed a lot of his subordinates to maintain a lot of power, which when that happens, a lot of times that leads to a lot of corruption. So there'll be a lot of corruption while he's president, although he's only president for about 2.5 years, a little less than that. He died of a heart attack in 1923. So Warren G. Harding, president of the United States, died in 1923 of a heart attack while in office. His vice president was Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge will wind up becoming president after Harding dies. But Harding was still alive. The biggest scandal that broke loose was this Teapot Dome scandal. This would involve a guy named Albert Fall. Albert Fall was a cabinet member. He's Secretary of the Interior, which meant that he kind of managed issues related to U.S. property here in the States. After World War I, the United States Navy did not need the Teapot Dome oil field. So Teapot Dome is the name of an oil field in Wyoming. So since the United States Navy didn't need it, they gave control of the oil field to Albert Fall and the Department of the Interior. So so Albert Fall is supposed to be overseeing this. But a wealthy oil executive from a company called the Sinclair Oil Company. Sinclair Oil Company is still around today. If you drive across the Midwest, I think they still have gas stations. It's the sign for Sinclair Oil Company is like a dinosaur, like a green dinosaur sign. But this executive from the Sinclair Oil Company told Albert Fall, hey, I would love to have access to that oil field. Would you mind if we access it? And here's some money. Ultimately, Albert Fall is going to get paid about $400,000 in gifts and money in order to access that Teapot Dome for the Sinclair Oil Company. Now, ultimately, news will get out that Albert Fall took bribes in order to give access to this oil to that company, and he winds up going to prison for about 9 months between 1931 and 1932. So Albert Fall is the first U.S. cabinet member to go to prison. So he went to prison after this Teapot Dome scandal. So you're familiar with the Teapot Dome scandal related to this oil field in Wyoming with Albert Fall, Secretary of the Interior, taking bribes to give access to that big oil company. We'll close off with Coolidge. I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, except that Coolidge was very much a laissez-faire president. He's not going to allow a lot of restrictions. He's not going to do a whole lot with the federal government to help out farmers. So the government's going to be real hands-off as we go through the 1920s with both Coolidge and Hoover. Hoover would wind up becoming president. He was Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge, so he had a cabinet position also. So Hoover was Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge. He will also have a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach to the economy. So we'll finish there. Hoover would take office in March of 1929 after being elected in 1928. And 7 months after Herbert Hoover took office, the great stock market crash, Black Tuesday, will happen, and we'll start with Black Tuesday tomorrow. So we'll end there today. That will conclude the 1920s for the most part. I'll let you guys go. Again, good job for the most part on the exams. For those who didn't do as well as you like, I'm sure you'll do better next time. Feel free to email me or contact me. Of course, I always have office hours from 12:15 to 1 o'clock. So just meet me there if you ever want to. You guys have a great day and take care. Bye. Sure, no problem.